We're live. Alexander, how are you doing this evening?
I'm very well, very much looking forward to this live, and I hope and believe that we'll be joined by the great Robert Barnes
Yes.
very soon, and we got huge things to talk about.
Yes, we are waiting for Robert to jump on.
Mm,
But as we wait for Robert, let's say hello to everybody that is
yeah.
watching us on Odyssey, on Rumble, on YouTube, and our locals community, the
Mm.
Duran.locals.com. How is everyone doing this evening? And let's see who is moderating in the chat. I see Zariel is with us. Zariel, how are you? Hope all is well with Zariel and Alan. The great Alan Watson is also moderating.
Mm,
And let me see if there's anyone else
mm,
that is moderating the chat. I think
mm,
that's everybody for
mm,
now. So, Alexander, we're going to have an interesting live stream.
well,
We're going to talk about Le Pen. We'll talk about face recognition and how it's being used
yeah,
in
yeah,
Ukraine. We'll talk about international law and this
mm,
conflict. We'll talk about Biden and the anti-war movement and just all kinds of
mm,
great stuff to talk about
absolutely.
with, with Robert.
Mm.
And I wanted to say something, but I forgot. So, do you have anything to say?
Well, I think, can I just say, obviously, in Britain, we're very close to France, so we're keeping a close eye on the election.
Mm,
I think there's a little bit of nervousness here about what the outcome may be. Now, over the last couple of days, we were hearing all kinds of reports about how the lead, Macron's lead, was widening and stabilizing, and that he was now 9 to 12% ahead. The very latest poll that I've seen shows that his vote, or rather not, sort of average of polls now put him just 5% ahead. So it looks like it's tightening. Now, do you remember during the presidential election in the United States, we were getting all sorts of very strange polls coming out in the run up to those elections? There were elections which were putting Biden 20% ahead of Trump. Be aware that there is always a possibility that could be looking at the same phenomenon in France. I'm not saying that's true, but if that is true, and I think it's quite likely given how controlled elections are in France, if it's 5%, if it's just a 5% Macron lead, then it's become very tight. And we have this debate tomorrow, which could be the decisive event.
right.
Macron, by all accounts, is very good at debate. He's trained to be. He went to the École Nationale d'Administration, that he pretends that he didn't, or has pretended that he didn't. He's, a trained anarch, as they say in France, a member of the French political class to his fingertips, despite the fact that he pretends to be an outsider. And the one thing those people are very good at is debate. So
All right.
we'll see how well Le
Well,
Pen stands up to him.
well, we got someone else who's very good at debate, and that
How much
is
better than Macron? I think he'll be
that is the great Mr. Robert
knock him
Barnes.
out
I
without any
think
trouble.
I think Macron would be very worried if he had to go up against you, Mr. Barnes. What do you think? How are you?
Hey, yeah, I think that the Rothschild Bank taught him well. It'll be interesting to see if well, one, I mean, Le Pen needs a game changer, so she should take more risks than Macron needs to take. But I mean, I think it's an interesting. Last time the center was much stronger in 2017 in France in the elections leading up to it. All he had to do was consolidate the center, and he was in. And last time in 2017, I had bet on Macron, Mélenchon, and Le Pen to get to the second round, and all three were interestingly substantial underdogs, particularly Macron because they expected the center right, center left to hold, and it didn't. And then I bet on Macron in the runoff just because it was clear that there's Le Pen's negatives were too high, and Macron was still mostly a blank slate. I mean, he was chosen, I think, because he was a blank slate.
Yeah.
The difference this time is two factors: the center no longer is held, and you basically have about a third each center parties, left parties, right parties. And then the second aspect is his negatives are as high as hers. So the question only in France, only under these unusual circumstances could someone with a near 60% disapproval rating win. But it's because she still has she has not been able to fully escape the shadow of her father, and she herself has a near 60% disapproval rating. And the question is, of those people who dislike both of them, how do they vote? And right now, enough of them are going, because so much institutional power is behind Macron. I mean, they even rewrote the script of the EU scandal. I mean, they did that in 2017. Oh, there's money's missing and all that jazz. Now they bring it back again, even though it's 10 years old and all, I mean, but I think the one, unless something changes between now and then, or something big happens at the debate, Macron is, probably deserves to be about a 2-1 favorite. I advised people to put money on Le Pen right at the beginning of the outbreak of the war, because I thought that would break into her favor, and it did consolidate her base away from Zemmour. And then she was at one point, she was trading at like 2.5%, 3% in certain European betting markets. Now she's, over 30%. And so, but I don't know how much higher value there is to squeeze out unless something changes between now and next Monday. But she'll do better than last time. That I don't have much doubt about. So if you could bet on margin, I think there's advantages there. And something still might change. And the fascinating thing is, throughout, there's such a massive gap, which we'll get into, between the political class and the population in all these countries. Even France, like Patrick Basham, who did a poll for the I think it was the Daily Express. It was one of the UK publications, but he's for the Democracy Institute. He was one of the few people to predict that Brexit would win. One of the few people that predicted that Trump would win in 2016. One of the few people that predicted it was very close in 2020. He sent me his poll results, and he has it within 2 points in France. And what he says, Macron will hold on unless something changes, but points out that they polled specifically on specific matters. Do you think Le Pen is too close to Russia? Do you think Le Pen is too soft on Russia? Do you think Le Pen is too harsh on the EU? Do you think, are you willing to pay higher prices in exchange for sanctions to, send a message to Putin? And in all of those cases, there was not a majority in France for Macron's position on any of those things. And generally, people did not think Le Pen was too soft on Russia or too conciliatory, or that her position on the EU or NATO was the wrong one, because she's kind of moderated her position on that. She's a skeptic, but no longer demanding exit. So I think Le Pen blew a great opportunity by not jumping against Macron on all the issues related to the mandates and lockdowns, and was not as assertive as she could have been, and may have put her in a much better position. She's kind of late to the party now, saying that she'll rehire the 15,000 health workers and other workers that were fired for not being vaccinated and so forth. But she probably needs a break to get over the edge. But man, it would be almost as enjoyable as Trump's win, watching the complete mental breakdown live if Le Pen somehow won in France.
Boy,
it will be much bigger than in.
Real quick, and
It will be bigger.
Alexander, I'm going to pass it off to you 1 second. Let me just let everyone know in the chat that we're going to try to get to people's questions if we have time. Alexander, 1 minute. I'm going to pass it off to you because there are a lot of questions about France. So let me just read through the super chats that came in. And then Alexander, Robert, you guys can talk about Le Pen, the Face ID in facial recognition taking place in Ukraine, war crimes, Biden, the backlash with Russia and Ukraine, and all of these great topics. NR, thank you for that $50 super sticker. Task Force, thank you. Right Cleese says, does the EU have the Johnson to stand up against the US? Robert and Alexander will discuss that as well. Hazim, thank you. Jay Rillo says, how does Mariupol falling change the war, if at all? We will discuss that as well. Kaliu, 25, says, you guys look sad and tired these days. Please take care of yourselves. Thank you, Kaliu, for that. Hazim says,
we're certainly tired. I don't know about whether we're sad, but we're certainly tired.
Well, Hazim says, is the Wagner Group real, and is it operating in Ukraine? We will discuss that as well, hopefully. Rahman, thank you. FL64 says, as Robert noted, the allegations towards Le Pen are a decade old. Yes, RDDR says liberalism failed its Cold War democratic mandate of uniting capitalist nations. The proof is Russia, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, Trump, and Brexit. Dimitra says, you are my daily vitamin D, gentlemen. Excellent work. Not Intimidated says, what did you think of Kaja Exis Ekman getting fired from his journalist job in Sweden by asking about the NAZI connection in the Kiev Independent? That's an interesting topic. Stevo says, Le Pen will win. Le Pen will win. How do you think that would affect the globalist agenda? You guys will discuss that. Midu, thank you. Sanjiva says, while the EU and the USA double down on sanctions and continue in their PR gobbledygook circus, the South is entering famine. Hundreds of millions of people who made it into the middle class are now right back in poverty. Alexander, thank you for that super sticker. Sparky says, Viva la France. Sanjiva says, this process started in part because the South idiotically followed the West in lockdowns, and in the COOF rankings, the QE in the USA decimated the South. South might never forgive the West for this. Jay Karzar, thank you. PJM says, no question. Thank you, Duran. Without you, we wouldn't be here. Love the channel. Love Mr. Barnes of the cigar. Any scotch, Mr. Barnes? Alexander Roberts, take it away.
Well, I think I'll start with the last points that you were all making. If Le Pen were to win, the meltdown in France, in Europe, in Britain, in Germany, and in Brussels would make even the meltdown that happened in America in 2016 pale. I mean, it would be the biggest political shock that you can just about imagine. And it will be such a big shock that it's debatable, actually, whether even Le Pen herself would be ready for it. But it would be an absolute earthquake. It is impossible to overstate the importance of France in making the weather politically across Europe. It's a key country within the European Union. It's a key country within NATO. It would in that case be the country that's articulating the anger with the elites that Robert was talking about, which we'll come to in a moment, because that's absolutely central to understanding this whole story. And of course, given that Le Pen is universally across the European center-left categorized as a fascist, it would mean that if you follow their ideological narrative picture, which, by the way, let me stress, in my opinion, has no connection to actual realities, certainly not where Le Pen is concerned. But, if somebody who the center, the establishment and the center and the left all say is a fascist, wins an election in a pivotal European country, well, frankly, that's something that I just don't know how they would get round or explain or find their way through. I would say that the problems a Le Pen as president would face would be enormous. And coming back to some of the points that Robert was making, I'm not sure, to be straightforward about it, how effective she would be in countering the kind of pressures that she would come under. But Robert, I'd like to turn to this business because I think this is, as you said, the key to the whole parcel. The fact that there are these massive negatives for Macron, which almost balance out the negatives that there are against Le Pen. And I'm going to say straight away, I think this is true everywhere in Europe. It may surprise you to know that there's local elections coming in Britain. I walked around the streets of London just a few minutes ago, walking my dogs. I found hardly a sign, a sticker anywhere for any of the political parties. I'm getting the sense that people in Britain are extremely dissatisfied with the political class here. I don't think that comes anywhere close to the anger, the sheer deep anger that there is in France. And I wonder to what extent this anger is going to spread to other places. So, Robert, can I just say, I mean, you're a gambling man. I'm not a gambling man, by the way. I've always not been good when it comes to gambling. I've never really been good for it. I also have to say, I think that the institutional weight behind Macron is going to be just too strong at the end of the day. And I'm going to make a suggestion, just a comparison, which is one that I think Americans might understand. It's like expecting in some places in the United States in 30 years after the Civil War that took place in the United States. It's like expecting, say, in the south of the United States, a Republican to win, or in somewhere like, say, Massachusetts, New England, a Democrat to win. The divisions in France go all the way back to the French Revolution. They were very deeply strengthened by the Second World War. I think that is the structural barrier that Le Pen faces. So I don't know what you think of that comparison. Whether you think that it's one that might explain things better to Americans, but having lived in France for a time, having got to know France quite well, I have to say I still find it difficult to a person who has been labelled in that kind of way to win an election in France.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's a couple things. One is one way I describe a lot of elections in Europe is that, and particularly continental Europe, is that it would be like if New York City had 5 times the voting power that it does in America, in the sense that the size of the Paris share of the French electorate is much higher than the New York City or LA or Chicago combined share of the US electorate is. Like here, our rural and small town areas in many of the states determine the outcome of an election, very small cities. You don't have big city dominance like you really do in continental Europe. I mean, I remember when I was studying whether to bet on the Dutch election years ago and realized how big Amsterdam was as a share of the vote. It's like that. Okay, that guy's not going anywhere. He might, overperform expectations, but he ain't winning. The anti-immigration, EU skeptical candidate in that case. I won't try to pronunciate that guy's name. But it's similar in France. I have never actually lost a bet on an election in Europe. I've never lost an election bet on the United States. What in Europe? So last time, that's the reason you articulate is why I took Macron, and that ended up being easy. There was an illusion that was more competitive than it was because of the first round results. This time, I do think it's closer. And then the question is, how much closer? And it really boils down to how that voter group that dislikes both. The big factor isn't going to be whether enough of them vote Le Pen, because enough of them won't. Too many of them voted for Mélenchon in the first round, and on issues of immigration, on issues of climate change, and as you note, this cultural bias. Particularly, I mean, there were precincts in Paris against Macron last time where she got low single digits. I mean, just absolutely obliterated, such that it didn't matter that she was able to win in some cases by double digits herself in working class areas in the northeast or the northwest of France and in parts of the south. Such a fascinating map in France, how it breaks down. As you note, long historical reasons for that. But can the combination of Bordeaux, Marseille, and Paris, and in particular Paris, will she do as bad as she did last time in such a way that even if she improves in the countryside, that she can't make up grounds? Now, I think the big key is whether they vote, actually. In other words, the reason why some of the polls are showing her very close is because they're doing a more deeper dive on whether someone votes. There already was lower turnout the first round than there was last time, and 2017 was a low turnout election by French standards already. I think this will be an even lower turnout election when you have two candidates with such high negatives, and some of those negatives are intense negatives. Like right now, the key is, the right will consolidate behind Le Pen. That's a little more than a third. The center will consolidate behind Macron. At this point, that's only a little bit more than a third, too. It's not the 50% plus it was last time due to the complete collapse of the center right, complete collapse of the center left, complete collapse of any center alternatives, and even collapse of older parties on the left. I think the Communist Party had the lowest vote they ever got. But it's really Mélenchon's voters that decide the election and how they will decide the election. And the reason why there's such a media onslaught against Le Pen, to remind them we are France, we don't elect fascists, that kind of nonsense from the establishment press and institutional sources of power. The trade unions are sending that message. Others are sending that message. Mélenchon himself, of course, said no to Le Pen, said don't vote for Le Pen, but didn't say vote for Macron or to vote at all, once again. And what the polling is showing is 2/3 of Mélenchon voters are saying they're not going to vote. If that actually happens, and then of the third that are, they actually do split evenly, because the kind of the class divide has intensified in France, and the age divide has as well. I mean, it's usually a populist candidate in most parts of the world benefits from the elderly voter. In France, there's such a traditional elderly voter that to be French is not to support someone like Le Pen, and probably longer memory of her father. The combination of the two, her biggest hurdles are older voters, upscale voters, and then whether young Mélenchon voters that don't like her, that would never vote for her, actually will get to the polls to vote for Macron. If they stay home, and for those that aren't as familiar, Mélenchon is kind of like the Corbyn of Britain, the Bernie Sanders of the United States. Peel is very young, sort of left populist, and the biggest gap between left populist and right populist across the globe, really, or at least in the West, has been issues like immigration and to a lesser extent climate change. But immigration has been the big divider line. Which is ironic. It wasn't, 6-7 years ago, Bernie Sanders was calling illegal immigration a plan of the Koch brothers to lower labor and wage supply in the United States. But all that shifted when it became part of woke culture and all that jazz. If they stay home, and I think there's a much higher chance they stay home this time than was the case in 2017, then it could get very close. The working and middle class, I have no doubt Le Pen will win a majority of the working class vote, the working class French vote, non-immigrant vote, the working class French vote, traditional French vote in France, which is striking by itself. It shows the rebellion of the working classes is spreading. Including people who identify themselves as left, though that too is kind of a French tradition. The hard left and hard right overlap on a wide range of issues, as they do in many parts of Europe, due to the presence of the EU. Mélenchon himself is a bit of an EU skeptic, not EU critics fully, but EU skeptic. Also, Mélenchon didn't jump on the war either. He wasn't cheerleading it. And Macron has made it. This is about French identity. French identity is not a Le Pen. But he has not made it. He's made it a little bit about the EU, and people have disputed whether he actually made the statements on immigration, but clearly that risk is coming. There's mass Ukrainian immigration already. What's going to happen with those millions of people? But an effect of the war is going to be famine in North Africa, and major. Unless the Russians solve that problem for those countries, because they are not anti-Russia at the moment. Countries like Egypt. Other countries, remember the Arab Spring happened when they had a bread crisis. And so they're about to have a much worse food crisis, as one of the super chatters mentioned, than anybody in the West, unless that problem is solved by the Russians. Maybe we'll see. I think the combination is such that right now she'd probably lose by 6 points, 7 points. If something happens between now and Monday, that shakes things up globally, some sort of immigration issue, something like that. If she really outshines him, I think one advantage she has is Macron is seen as you noted, as a very smooth, classic French style debater, very good on the public stage. But that means the expectations are all on him. If he screws up and says something wrong, it will have a bigger impact than if she does. And I do think she needs to roll the dice and take some gambles to shake things up, because the race institutionally favors him. Because even though they both are equally disliked, there's people that just cannot imagine ever voting a Le Pen into power in France. It's a bigger barrier than it was, say, Trump or Brexit or other aspects, psychologically, particularly among certain populations. But if she can just get Mélenchon's young voters that can't stand her to stay home, which a lot of them are saying they are, then it could be a very long night on election night. But so right now, I would say where the odds are about right. I thought the odds were wrong leading up to the first election, but now they're probably about right. But if I were betting either way, if I had to bet, I'd bet on Le Pen is worth more as an underdog than Macron is as a favorite, because of these underlying dynamics of. And then the other thing for people to watch an election night is very low turnout. If particularly in the urban precincts, if you have urban youth precincts where you have a big youth population, then that might be a sign. I remember on election night in Brexit, I was able to get bets in. I couldn't get as much in as I wanted to, because unfortunately I was not in Europe at the time. But at the beginning on election night, Brexit was trading at 10-1 in the betting markets, even though some of those classic Middle England labor towns had already come in because they count them live. They do election. It's interesting how you can count votes, compared to say a certain 2020 election. But some of these labor towns were coming in with pro-Brexit voting patterns. I was like, okay, this is a sign this thing is going to be dead tight at a minimum. It shouldn't be a 10-1. If you see low precinct returns coming in, if you see low turnout being reported, particularly in some of the big urban centers, can Le Pen get enough votes, and more importantly, Macron not get his voter base out? Then it could actually be a very fun night watching the media breakdown, just if it's tight. Either way, I think a net effect of this election, they're clearly holding back on information related to the war because they're hoping not to tip, which tells you they know that, I mean, just like in Pakistan, you don't have to do the regime change quasi coup if you think the elections will go your way in 90 days. Clearly, they didn't think it would go their way after they witnessed what happened in both Hungary and Serbia. You dig into the polling data, but you can just watch their reaction. The fact that they're withholding data and information about the Ukraine war, the fact that Macron's not talking much about the war at all in the campaign and the runoff campaign, tells you even the political class knows that the populace, even in a country like France, the kind of cultural heart of the EU, I mean, I don't think EU could imagine a EU without Paris. That's unimaginable, inconceivable. It tells you that they know that the working classes of Europe do not support their policies, do not support this war, do not support these economic sanctions. There was a fascinating poll done that showed when they asked people in Europe, would you be willing to support just economic sanctions against Russia if it meant you would pay a higher gas bill, either in your home or for your car or anything else? They could not get a majority in a single country in Europe. The closest they got was a majority in the western part of Germany. They could not get a majority anywhere else. They were in the low 40s. And it was basically a plurality split because you had 15 to 20% say they don't know, which is honestly the honest answer probably for a fair number of people. But you can guess those don't knows would break no ultimately because of the dynamic of it, the political dynamic of it. So you aggregate those factors, and I think what you find or what you get is the working classes nowhere. So not even Britain, the working classes don't support the war, which is probably a good transition into the long story short, Macron should be probably a 3-2 favorite. Watch on election night. You might be able to make some money for those of you out there in the European betting markets that have access to it, Betfair Exchange, other places like that. Because there might be value during the night if you see unusually low turnout, if they report that, if you see early reports from certain places that Le Pen is overperforming enough, because what she needs to run almost 8-9 points higher in individual precincts to be a legitimate favorite compared to how she performed in 2017. And in particular, does she get into the double digits? Like 15, 16, 17% in certain places in Paris, or that are culturally kindred, parts of Bordeaux, parts of Marseille. Bordeaux and Paris seem to sort of be more culturally aligned that way. And then you'll know. I mean, I don't think she'll be able to pull it off at the moment, but it would be absolutely delightful if somehow she even makes those boys sweat in Brussels.
I completely agree. I agree with pretty much everything that you said, Robert. Can I just say, you have a question? Somebody's asked what you think about the margin. How big is the margin of error, of fraud in French elections? I believe you said about a point. Can I just give my own thought about that? I mean, I've followed elections in France. My own experience of French elections is that they are incredibly heavily managed and manipulated elections, even more than they are in most countries. But I think that they know, the French establishment doesn't like to actually do overt fraud in elections, because they know what a volatile country France is in some respects. And I think they realized that if they did that and they discredited the whole election process, well, in France, that might be more difficult to explain away and difficult to control. Having said that, there's always a first time. And, I'm not sure how fraud would be done in a French election, but I don't generally think it's a common problem in France. What they're much more skilled at is deciding who the candidates are, creating these institutional forces, getting us out, as Robert said, the trade unions to come out, putting pressure in all the sort of banlieues and all those places for people to come out and vote, and basically assembling coalitions to block out the person that they want to stop. I don't know what your thoughts are about this, Robert.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, the fascinating thing is in continental Europe, they haven't adopted this mass technology that we've adopted in the West. They don't have certain looseness and liberalization of rules, and their election officials, particularly your French type. I always think of a librarian. You know what I mean? It's the kind of people who manage the administrative, bureaucratic side of the aisle will do things, very correctly. That's what they value, to do it proper. In that French way. And so you don't have a problem on that side of the aisle very often. It is, as you note, the best way to look at it is look at what the EU accuses Orban of manipulating the elections, or of Putin of manipulating the elections. That's how they manipulate the French elections. Disparate media influence, the weaponization of the criminal or legal process for questionable purposes, all of those things, which they've done to Le Pen now repeatedly. I mean, she faced multiple bogus cases after getting close in the last election, as kind of punishment for trying to do so, and as an effort to discredit. For those people that are baffled by it, it's like, okay, how can Macron have 60% disapproval or thereabouts? Inflation spiking throughout France as to core ingredients. I mean, if any place knows why you should make sure bread costs stay low, it should be the political leaders of France. But they had a few revolutions over just bread. But but it's because of the older population and the younger melon. Think of your young Bernie Sanders AOC types. Would they ever embrace Trump? No. And you think, and then think of your older traditional people who really thought Trump was Hitler kind of people, which that just didn't exist in the U.S. like it exists in France as to Le Pen.
Yes.
But the other way I described it, third way, is to think of it if cities like New York and Chicago and L.A. and San Francisco and the District of Columbia, imagine if they had much more political power than they do in America.
Yes.
And that's true of France, because that's what Paris is like.
Absolutely. I mean, it's difficult to understate the dominance politically of Paris and, by the way, London in the political life of the two countries, in France and in Britain. The one thing that can happen, though, and this is also true in France, and it's certainly true in Britain, is that you can find that the rest of the country can react badly to the political force that's being imposed on them from Paris, if you're talking about France. And of course, the real danger is when they sort of unite against it. I mean, and that has happened in French history. I mean, somebody was asking, about whether there's ever been big elections that the French right won. Well, one very important election that the French right won was the one that was called the parliamentary election, which was called in 1968 after the May uprising in Paris. And that was, to an enormous extent, a reaction of the country against, it was country versus town. It was the feeling of the French regions that what's going on in Paris is not something we want to be involved in, and we're going to really respond strongly against it. So, I mean, there've been elections which the right has won. And by the way, can I just say that, of course, the right in France is different from the right in some other countries. It's basically been a right that has supported dirigiste economic policies. It has a much more paternalist approach to sort of economics, to social things, than is the case in the rights in some other countries, like say Britain. And that's one reason why there is this great overlap between right and left in France that you don't always find in other places, and which Robert spoke about earlier. Anyway, I'm going to wait and see what's going to happen in France. I'm very, very interested. And I think the other big story about that election is the collapse of the center. I think you're absolutely right. The socialists, gone. The Republicans, gone. The communists, as you absolutely rightly say, who were absolutely part of the French establishment 30, 40 years ago. I remember when I used to go to Paris in the 70s, how they were everywhere. They were absolutely part of the political establishment at that time. They've gone too. You have this amorphous, elitist, remote, unpopular person, Macron. I was saying what a great debater he is, how smooth, articulate, whatever. Of course, that actually can work against him too. It can just remind people what an establishment figure he is. The fact that he comes from elite education institutions, that he embodies the French, énarque, which a lot of people in France at the moment are very angry with. So it can work against him as well. So you have this solitary figure holding something at the center together. It's difficult to convey if you haven't been to France and haven't mixed with French people, how weird also Macron comes across to many French people. I mean, he comes across as a very, very weird figure, but nonetheless, ultimately, the structural problems that are holding back Le Pen, I suspect in the end are going to be insurmountable unless she does the performance of her life in the debate tomorrow. That's my view. I don't know if you've got anything else to add, Robert. I mean, well, feel free to add
or some
whatever
other news. Like if the
Or
roles
some-
were reversed, I would be
Yeah.
expecting a false flag event. Like if it was Macron behind and something
Yeah.
needed to happen between now and election day, like
Yeah.
what Macron needs there is no riots, no Muslim riots in the northern
Yeah.
suburbs of
Yeah.
Paris.
Yeah.
I mean, people don't know, unlike the States, the closer to the city you are, the wealthier you are in Europe generally. And that's like the suburbs, as you further out you go, is the poorer it gets. In the States, it's not that way, obviously, for reasons of unique geographical development, urban planning after the 1940s. But yeah, I think unless something happens in the debate or something new happens, and I'm sure all the political pressure in the establishment will do everything possible to make sure that does not happen. But then Macron will be able to barely get back in. But his party's going to be weaker, I think, in the ultimate parliamentary elections, and he will be weaker. And it'll be interesting to see how he handles it. If the election is really close and he barely gets in, does he join the Germans in pushing more for what? And this may be a good transition. What Donald Trump called for yesterday. Which credit to Trump. Sometimes, by golly, he's a little slow to the wake-up call. And I know my friends on the left can never tolerate Trump, but the reality is, who's the only major politician in the Western world calling and demanding peace immediately and a diplomatic resolution immediately? His name is President Donald John Trump, who yesterday said that the only thing that benefits from this war continuing is a bunch of people dead. Fascinating the way he puts things. He's like, I understand people are saying the war should continue or accelerate, but then just a bunch of people are dead. Why do we want a bunch of people dead? Let's have peace. And I think one outcome, the closer this election is, the more likely I think Macron will feel pressure to join the Germans at getting the Ukraine off the Biden and British agenda. And we can talk about the Brits. Man, have they gone crazy. Somebody's got to let the Brits know the empire is gone. It really is bye-bye. I mean, I saw some British newspaper said, well, they'll fight it alone. You couldn't win World War I alone. You couldn't win World War II alone. Why are you going to win this one alone? But, even especially now, the Brits were a lot stronger back then, frankly, than in my opinion they are now militarily. But I think one good thing with this election is it will put more pressure on the peace side of the equation. And the best way for Macron to restabilize his second administration would be to get a peace deal out of the war, not for the war to continue to accelerate, not for him to continue to suffer economically. Credit to Le Pen, who is like, well, we shouldn't do any sanctions that hurt the local population because she cares about her country, and said any other ones that we do at the request of the United States, well, the U.S., Biden can write us a check. to deal with. You know, those are some smart strategic choices she's made, because that's right in the heart of French opinion. But hopefully, just a closer election, I think, will put pressure for peace to occur. And Macron would most politically benefit from peace occurring if he barely skates in to a second term.
If Le Pen wins, or if Macron wins by a very, very tight margin, then this is going to put the absolute terror across the entire European political class. In Germany, there will be shock. In Italy, there will be fear. Now, Mario Draghi in Italy has taken a very strong pro-war line. He gave a very, very provocative, I thought, and belligerent interview to Corriere della Sera in Italy. Well, of course, if the margin in France is so tight that people in Italy fear that in an election, say the brothers of Italy might sweep in, then of course that might induce them in the interests of their own survival, not just in France, but in Italy, in Spain, in all sorts of places, to say, look, this has gone as far as it can go. We're now at real risk of losing control. We've seen the center collapse in France. We can't have that happen here in Italy or in Spain or wherever. And that's why we start moving and demanding peace. It's not impossible. I'm not saying it's going to happen, because it's difficult. Now, it's difficult always, I find, to predict what the political class in Europe are going to do, because somebody's saying that Europe is dead, and that the Europeans know it would explain why they vote as they do. I think that's much too strong. I don't think it's true. I think the European political class don't think of themselves as a Europe being dead. I think they're very puffed up at the moment. And I think the European electorates in many places are under enormous pressure and becoming extremely angry. But Europe is a country with enormous history, very complex. And as I said, I think it's easy to manipulate European electorates. And we don't have the openness to debate things that you do in the United States. So I think that probably explains why Europeans are voting the way they're doing up to now. But if France shows that there is another way, as I said, it's pivotal, its influence can be extraordinary, and it can change things radically right across Europe. I think that's probably my last word on this issue, but it's certainly a very important election. And regardless of whether or not Macron wins, the most important story in it, looking forward, is the total collapse of the center. We have a left around Mélenchon. We have a right around Le Pen. It's difficult to feel that these are not the future in France. For the first time since the Second World War, a right which is seen as outside the establishment, and a left which is seen as being outside the establishment, have outpolled the center. And that is an extraordinary event in the life of France.
Yeah, especially for France. I mean, for a country that kind of prides itself on a certain kind of moderation. In other words, it's a place where to be part of the French establishment isn't seen as instinctively bad as it is in other countries. It's kind of like a form of respectability. It's like one thing people couldn't understand about Trump is that Trump's economic success was seen by a lot of working class constituencies in America as something to be proud of. The fact that he was gauche, the fact that he had gold toilets, was something that was cool in certain working class segments in America. In the same sense, to be respectable is to be French to a certain degree. And the fact that that country is rebelling against those ideas, those EU ideas, fundamentally, is, as you note, any close election in Europe will shake them to their core in ways that Orban's surprise landslide and Serbia's surge and the Pakistani protest in response to the removal of that populist didn't. I mean, those things unsettled them enough to where they're playing it tight with Macron in the sense of let's not say anything about new embargoes. Let's not say anything about military intervention. Let's dial down that rhetoric until we can get Macron across the finish line. But it will really, really shake him up and really shock him. And I think the other question you go to is people ask, why is there this gap between the political class and the population of all these countries? And I take it back to Christopher Lash's Revolts of the Elites, or this is another good book called The Managerial Class on Trial, written by a Canadian professor. Which is that Lash in the mid-90s said that the new elites, what's unique about them, why he called them Revolt of the Elites, is that they are not loyal to country. They are loyal to sort of a kind of globalist superstructure that they see. It's the Madeleine Albright, Colin Powell debate of the 1990s, where they're sitting around the cabinet, and Madeleine Albright says, "What good are soldiers if we don't use them?" And Colin Powell says, "They're not tokens on a risk board, Madeleine." But Madeleine's concept is that they see nations as tools, not a population to protect, not an economy to develop, not as a society to protect, but rather as a means to institute sort of a globalist kind of project, but basically a project that's not rooted in nationhood and national identity and national loyalty. I mean, many of these people see patriotism as gauche, as déclassé. These are not people. They'll be happy to put a Ukrainian flag up. You'll find them over their dead body before they put their own country's flag up. And you can kind of see the unity of this in the neocons from the 80s that started out in the 60s with the neoliberals that rose up in the 90s. They came up mostly under this sort of globalist umbrella as personified by two people, Victoria Nuland and Hillary Clinton. Like, how does somebody who is Dick Cheney's staffer, Dick Cheney, the hated Darth Vader of the right, according to the left, how does Barack Obama put her in charge of Ukrainian policy that got us here? Well, the bridge is Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton united the neocon and neoliberal wings that mostly care about a sort of globalist superstructure. Bill Kristol could care, and you see this reflected most actually in economic policy. I mean, to some degree, Britain, aspects of Europe, France. I mean, part of the key Le Pen supporter is the old industrial regions that have been decimated by this globalist project, which the EU is an expression of, NATO is an expression of, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are expression of. But like, they love trade deals that create this sort of global elite financial, cultural, hegemonic influence. In that, the same neocons and neoliberals supported NAFTA, supported China's entry into the World Trade Organization. These are things that were going to devastate the American manufacturing base. They have in many cases embraced, the neocons less so, but increasingly so, embraced climate change politics. Even though it is devastating to the energy development, and not only energy development, but like rare earth mineral development, mining development in the United States and in the West. China's happy about that because guess who has a lot of the rare earth minerals? Same with Russia. I mean, people got confused at times by China and Russia being really worried about climate change. Look at their domestic policies and see how concerned they are about climate change. They want the West to be concerned about climate change because it gives them a regulatory edge, a competitive edge, a resource development edge, a resource near monopoly edge. And so I think the one key factor in understanding is that the political class in Europe and the West cares more about this sort of globalist type project and their own utopian vision than they do loyalty to their own people. This is why Germany's doing things that hurt their economy right now. France is doing things that hurt their economy right now. As you mentioned, Italy, doing the, all the political class in Italy should take a double look at their debt and what happens if certain things happen in the interest rate markets. I mean, how long can they keep interest rates negative in Europe if they're going to actually try to maintain or contain inflation that's exploding and expanding? But it's because they don't care about their own people. They care much more about they care more about each other's approval than they care about their people's approval. I mean, you see this reflected often when they say to China, if you don't go along with us, your standing in the international community will decline. And it's like, why do you think China cares what somebody in Brussels thinks about them? China has a much longer history than even people in Brussels understand. And so, they're not, I mean, I'm a China critic because of the Chinese Communist Party and its various economic and social and cultural policies. However, I'm not naive in believing that China just cares about whether somebody at the EU holds them in high esteem. This is like, cliquish high school politics almost. And it's because this is their mindset. And that's why once you understand that mindset, it's easier to predict how disconnected they'll be. I mean, you follow some of these Twitter threads. They are in such tiny bubbles of these people that are kind of affiliated or associated with them. And that this whole class of people can't help but talk. And they love to talk on Twitter more than any other place. So they expose themselves. Like, when Elon Musk talks about buying Twitter, all of a sudden they explicitly say, well, no, we need to make sure censorship is maintained. And Joe Scarborough and his wife there, we're here to tell you what to think, not what you think for yourselves. So but this political class is completely removed. It creates dangerous problems because it's like the political class, as we've talked before, of the World War I empires that all collapsed after World War I. I mean, think if you're the Habsburgs, you've been ruling for like 600 years in some form. And even though, you're on 15th round of no branches on your family tree, first cousins and uncles and nieces marrying again, and that probably not being beneficial. That's why your jaws look like something, I don't know, whatever. But but you're still used to 600, 700 years of uninterrupted power. If you're the Russian Empire, several centuries of uninterrupted power. The Ottoman Empire, 6 centuries relatively of uninterrupted power. They all collapse, along with the British Empire. Effectively collapses at the end of World War I. I mean, it's been the beginning of the end of the British pound being the world's reserve currency. And none of these political class, you go back and read their writing, none of them saw it coming. And we have the same political classes now in the West that thank God for elections, because it's the only thing that wakes them up to, maybe our population will rebel against us and take us to the political guillotine if we keep going down this perilous path. But I think it's also important to understand the nature of these political elites. And it reflects to another topic later that there's a lot of misperception out there in America. Because one of the relevant, pertinent parts about Le Pen, too, is anti-war sentiments are as strong on the right as they are on any other part of the political spectrum in the West, frankly. But I mean, that's kind of a new phenomenon, but not really in terms of places like France and other places. But in the United States, it's always been there. And I'll get into the, some people argue there's this sort of leftist mythology that built up after the anti-American cause hijacked the anti-war cause during the Cold War. And the net effect of it was to create this kind of leftist impression of the anti-war cause and to make the right look like they're a bunch of warmongers. And I was in this sort of leftist mythology, a lot of which was rooted in communist mythology. It's the evil American empire, and that's what's driving these people is they want to be part of an American distinct empire, and that's to protect the American people and the American population, and the Americans are just a bunch of Vikings and Mongols who can't wait for the next raid and can't wait for the next war. And the problem is that's always been bad political analysis. The American population, as opposed to its political class, has been instinctively anti-war for forever. I'll go through like the 10 different elections that prove this just in the last century. I'll give the recent examples of J.D. Vance, what's happening to the Republican base and all of that. But I think the two misnomers out there that has created some public misperception is not understanding that the political class doesn't care about their own country, and not understanding that the opposition to war is much broader amongst the people, even including those in the West, than is popularly reflected in their political class.
I think this is absolutely correct. Can I just say, Revolt of the Elite is a brilliant, brilliant analysis. And if you want to understand one of the fundamental reasons why they are so unnerved and angry with people like Putin, first and foremost, and with the Russians, and indeed the Russian system altogether, is, of course, that the Russians don't want to be invited to their parties. This is the point. This is point people must understand. I mean, it's, and I mean, I've seen this. I've actually witnessed this phenomenon. I think you have it even more perhaps in Europe amongst the European political class than you do in the United States. That it is very much a system in which these people network constantly with each other. If you have spent any time in Brussels, you will know that there's endless sort of forums and groupings where people come together and they talk to each other. They don't actually come up with much in terms of practical policy, but they blend, they mix, they get to know each other, and a particular type of mindset develops. And it's also a mindset which is a profoundly elitist one, very, very remote from people, because that's what they like to feel themselves to be. They like to feel that they're a group that is deciding everything, that has this refined understanding of things, that there's this deep sense of culture, and that they are unnerved by the people who, in the sort of, the suburbs, the cities, the factories, the farms, whom they don't really actually have much in common with or much understanding of. And it's an important thing to understand, I think, because this is a revolt of elites. It's not a revolt of experts, as I've sometimes seen people say, because experts come in many forms. They can be engineers, they can be scientists sometimes, they can be generals, they can be lawyers. The elite class that governs us today is not based on expertise in the conventional sense. Look at how many engineers there are in the European Commission today. If you want to talk about what the political class is made up of, what the elites are made up of, it's people who come from basically two fields: finance, and that includes some elements of the law that are connected to finance, and journalism.
Oh, precisely. And that's where the other aspect to all of this is, like, for those that asked early on about, is this an American project, so on and so forth. It's only an American project in that they see America as a plaything on their risk board.
Yeah.
And it's this sort of it's like New York social society just shifted into the political class of Europe and the West. And they're sitting around competing for winning the risk game. But they don't value, it's not an American empire in the sense of actually caring about American people, developing American power. I mean, they are risking the dollar's dominance that has been a critical aspect of American soft power that might evaporate within a decade. And if people study the history of currencies suddenly collapsing as reserve currencies, it can happen fast. I don't think some people are talking about 6 months, a year. That won't happen at all. But it can absolutely happen in a decade. We could be less than half of, and there's a difference between the world's transactional currency and the world's reserve currency. Those can be two different things. If nobody's buying our T-bills and our bonds are dropping like a rock, and we have unmanageable economic sustenance in the States. And I think one of it, like, here's a good, this is a good transition into American political ramifications. We've got to witness it in live time in the Ohio Senate Republican primary. So the people that, what happened in the, historically, America's been a deeply don't get involved in foreign entanglements place. And the myth of muscular American warmongering was originated by largely the Marxist left historians in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And it just doesn't accurately reflect the American mindset. There's a reason why John Quincy Adams' speech to Congress is so well known, even to this day, amongst the people that grow, is because it was taught in schools back in the 1830s, 1840s. We do not go abroad. We do not go searching abroad for monsters to destroy. Lest, in effect, the rest of the speech is, lest, in effect, we become the monster ourselves. And that's why they had to engineer so many egregious false flags to get us into first the Spanish-American War, then World War I. And World War I was so intensely unpopular that it led to the rise of deep isolationist sentiments, what was called isolationist sentiments. I would call it non-interventionist sentiments in the 1930s in the United States, where in 1920s, war racketeering committee hearings about how the war profiteers, the war machine. The only time we've had meaningful hearings happened by a Republican senator, Gerald Nye, in the Senate, but he had support from Bora and a bunch of other Hiram Johnson, other Republican populists on the issues of war. And it continued even after the wars. You noted, the only guy to vote against the Gulf of Tonkin in the House of Representatives was a populist congressman from eastern Kentucky on the border of Tennessee. Not surprisingly, Thomas Massey, who represents kind of the libertarian anti-war side, is from Covington, Kentucky, right up the road where that congressman is from. Appalachia used to pour out to vote against war in the 1940s. And, you can just look, the winning war party went to an election in 1920. They got crushed. The winning war party went to an election in 1946 in the House. They got crushed. The winning war party went to an election in 1952. They lost the White House for the first time in a quarter century. The winning war party in 1968, after winning the biggest landslide in the history in 1964, lost power, the presidency. The winning war party in 1992, when it was the Bushes, because most of these have been Democrat wars. Democrats don't, they always wage war for the women and the children and the kids and the freedom and all that jazz. Republicans, everybody's suspect. Why are you waging war? But, Poppy Bush, Panama, Iraq gets crushed. And who does he get crushed by? He gets challenged by a populist anti-war Republican, Patrick Buchanan, and by the biggest independent vote getter in the presidential history, Ross Perot. And what was part of his campaign? No blood for oil. Then in 2000, of course, Gore loses. Why does Gore lose? Because Bush ran as we're not going to be the world's policeman. People forget this. After in 1999, Clinton had escalated in his second term conflicts in Serbia, Sudan, Somalia, and the massive sanctions in Iraq. That's when Madeleine Albright was like, 500,000 dead kids in Iraq, no problem. Bragged about it on CBS 60 Minutes. So again, the war party, or the party associated with the war, loses. Hillary Clinton lost the Democratic presidential primary in 2008 because of her Iraqi war vote. The Democrats seized power in 2006 and 2008 because of George W. Bush's warmongering. In 2016, Donald Trump beats again Hillary Clinton because of her warmongering history. And the number one factor to predict who would switch from Obama to Trump was the number of people that had been lost per capita to foreign wars in the prior 2 decades. So there's this long history of it. But here you had in the Republic, everybody was scared. Our entire political class was terrified here. They got 100-0 in the Senate. Sad Rand Paul, but the rest of them, all a bunch of wusses. Don't want to challenge the deep state apparatus. Don't want to challenge the military-industrial complex. I was getting calls when this happened from several high-profile candidates. Won't go into names, but the one to watch was J.D. Vance, because the Ohio Senate race is very competitive. Before the war started, J.D. Vance was in the single digits, as low as 4th or 5th in the primary polling. Trump was going to be making his decision within a couple of months about who to endorse in the race. And what does J.D. Vance do? J.D. Vance decides to take the populist anti-war position. He goes into debates and says, we have no business getting over there. We should not be in a no-fly zone. He made the point, I'm a Marine like some of the other people on here, but I don't go around brandishing that as the reason to vote for me for the United States Senate. These are warmongers. And, goes on Tucker Carlson and promotes it. Tucker Carlson being the only populist voice within the institutional media to voice skepticism of the war. And there were other indicators that this is where the actual Republican base was, because the Congress people closest to the Republican base, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Thomas Massey on the Libertarian side, Paul Gosar, Madison Cawthorn, Matt Gaetz, all of them voted against sanctions. And it's like, why is it the people that have the biggest social media followings, that are the people that other Republican primary candidates call on to either endorse, get their list, raise money for them, come and get public attention for them? Why are the people closest to the base voting against sanctions if this is a popular war party in the Republican primary? And again, this is the reason why people thought it was is because of this anti-American constituency on the left that hijacked the anti-war movement in the late 1960s. America First was an anti-war movement. That's where the term originated in the 1940s. That turned into, we don't fly the flag, we burn the flag. The anti-war movement was, we celebrate soldiers. This is why they didn't understand how Trump could go into South Carolina in 2016 in the primaries and say, yeah, George W. Bush should be impeached for that war. And the entire media say, that's it, he's done, he's finished. South Carolina Republicans love the military. Yes, they do love the military, and it's because they love the military that they don't love war. And that's what they didn't understand. Well, that's because the anti-American left that took on the anti-war message in the late 1960s was, they didn't celebrate soldiers, they spat on soldiers. But that was all of those people, in my view, should write big checks to the war machine. I'm still kind of agitated about it because that's what they did. They obviously didn't realize they were doing that, but by associating the anti-war cause with an anti-American cause, they helped the war machine. And in my view, they had as much to do with extending Vietnam as Nixon did. because it gave him the political permission slip to do so, because the ordinary working class voter went back between I'm against the war to I hate these war protesting hippies. I mean, that's how you get the hard hat riots of the early 1970s and movies and songs like Meet Joe, etc. But so J.D. Vance got to be a test case. Let's see in a contested Republican Senate primary where he's going up against one candidate who had already won statewide office before, another candidate who's self-funded and can completely outfund him. What does taking a position on the war do? Does it collapse his support? The Wall Street Journal did one of these fake journalistic pieces where they go and talk to their 6 pals in the state and they pretend it's a random sample of the state of Ohio. They're like, oh, J.D. Vance, this is going to be real unpopular, taking the side of Putin, taking the side of Russia. Well, what do we get 2 months later? J.D. Vance has surged to within a statistical tie of first. Trump watches all of this. Trump decides to endorse J.D. Vance. So now J.D. Vance is the favorite to win in the Republican Senate primary. And how did he get there? By choosing the anti-war, don't get involved, don't intervene. No, this is all nonsense with a no-fly zone. We shouldn't even be doing some of these sanctions. They don't make any sense. They're not in our interest. All of the populist anti-war position, that's how he jumped and tripled his support to where he got Trump support. And it's not a coincidence that within days of Trump endorsing J.D. Vance, after being on all sides of this war publicly, which is classic Trump, all of a sudden he issues that statement, the written statement that says there should be peace now. There should be a diplomatic resolution now. This war never would have happened if I would have been in power. I personally believe that's the case. But for which we have 4 years of evidence that it didn't happen while he was in power. But that's going to put massive pressure on every other Republican, because now by far the most popular Republican, the guy who's almost a shoo-in at this point to get elected in 2024, he's saying no more calls for escalating the war like is happening on Fox News on a nightly basis. No more calls for more sanctions and more aggressive action, more intervention, like not only Senator Chris Coons is saying publicly, but other Republicans are leaking out that they're demanding of the Biden administration privately behind the scenes. This is going to put massive pressure on them to reconsider their political positions. It's smart politics for the midterms. The only thing that could save Joe Biden at this point is a war that Republicans were deeply entangled with, that they could not disassociate from as its unpopularity inevitably grew. Because in the States, it's even stronger than Europe. In the States, I mean, there are more countries in Europe that believe Russia is to blame for this war than the United States, people in the United States do, according to the same poll conducting a pollster around the globe. In the States, there's never been, as soon as you ask a question, you can get a surface level of support. Do you like Putin? Do you like Ukraine? Do you like Zelensky? All of that you can get what is fake support, artificial turf support. The only guy who was really uber aggressive, we used him as a fake instead, because nobody in the Germans could believe we would put our best general on a fake mission, but we did. So I think in American politics, the populist anti-war persuasion is skyrocketing. That's best evidenced by J.D. Vance and Donald Trump's statement this week. And it will only grow in that direction. And people still caught up in this sort of the left's version of American politics will miss it, will miss the boat. And the political class is starting to recognize it, in particular because of Trump's statement. They're baffled by it. The Wall Street Journal's like, this doesn't make any sense, because they can't read a poll. And they're like what you're describing as the French and European political class. Who are these peasants? It's like the commies of the late 1890s who wanted to be pretend populist and went out to meet with the peasants and then couldn't understand why the peasants looked at them like they were complete aliens. It's that same, fake populist is how I put it. As George Orwell said, the only problem with socialism is all the socialists. It's the same thing. But so I think politically, that's where the direction is going in the States. The scary thing is that we have Joe Biden, who has to have the Easter Bunny move him away from people because he doesn't know where he's at and what he's saying, and is busy shaking hands with his 81 million voters who were about as visible in who he was shaking hands with as those 81 million voters were from the 2020 election. Downside is that means, Matt, if you're the deep state apparatus, or if you want to call it national security apparatus or anything else, and you're pushing Biden to get further involved in this war, you're getting both more desperate because of what's happening in the military conflict there, but you're also getting more desperate domestically. Biden is starting to head towards the 20s. They're looking at losing 70 to 80 House seats if things continue. And now that Trump is putting pressure on the Republican Party to stay out of this war politically, that was their only fault line risk. That's going to put massive pressure on Biden to take a big gamble. And they're escalating by leaking threats of indictment against Hunter Biden. And I'll explain why I don't think that would happen a little bit later on. But I think an extortionate strategy because they cannot lose Russia. They never to Russia. It was unimaginable to them. In Europe, it was clearly unimaginable to them, this political class. The same is true of the Victoria Nulands, the Hillary Clintons, etc. I mean, just go back to how nobody around Hillary Clinton thought she could lose in 2016. It had to be Putin stole it from her. I mean, that was their idea of logic. So I think given all of those dynamics, there is frighteningly going to be massive political incentive to take a big gamble by the Biden administration that happens to align with deep state agendas, which is to put American troops officially, because they're already there unofficially, but unofficially officially on the ground in Ukraine.
I'm unmuted. Just a few quick points in support of some of the things that Robert said. Years and years and years ago, when I was studying the US as a history student, I studied the Vietnam War, and I looked at who actually opposed the Vietnam War in the United States in the 60s, which is the demographic that opposed the war. And by the way, and this is completely this is a complete misconception. It wasn't students. It wasn't the people that you see on those demonstrations. By far the most solid, consistent anti-war demographic in the United States was middle-aged and above, middle class, working class people. They didn't like the war from the start. They solidly opposed it. And they voted for Nixon in 1972, not because McGovern, who was the Democrat candidate, was anti-war, but because they found him far too radical on virtually everything else. It was not the anti-war side of McGovern that made them consolidate behind Nixon. They rather liked that. It was because, as I said, they saw him as being, exactly as Robert said, connected with the sort of extreme radicalism of that period that had taken control of the Democrat Party. And I remember researching this. There was a time when I could have given you the figures. I had all the sort of figures at my fingertips. It's a long time ago. I don't remember it, but it certainly made the impression, because of course it's not what you hear about so much today. So I have never been one who's had any doubt at all that the mass of the American people, of the electorate, I have never really been anywhere near as belligerent as, I have to say, their political classes or parts of their political classes. And certainly, I'm going to say this as well. I mean, I also think that because we had a much longer tradition of war in Europe, I think we have a much greater appetite for war and conflict in Europe than has been the case in the United States. And I think that in Europe, obviously, you only have to look at our history to see why. And I come back, I know this is controversial with some people. I think that the United States was to some extent seen by many people who went there, emigrated there in the 19th century and the early 20th century. One of the reasons that attracted them to the United States was precisely because it was a place which was not constantly drawn into contests, violent actions, hostilities in the way that old Europe was. The militarism of old Europe was one of the things that drove those people away and made them go to the United States. So that's these are just historical points, which, as I said, I remember because unusually at that time in Britain, I'm talking about the 1970s, early 80s. I actually, as part of my history degree, I actually chose to study American history, and I found it a fascinating subject altogether. Now, I have to say, Robert, I was not aware that there has been this shift in the Republican Party, in the grassroots of the Republican Party, in an anti-war direction. It is music to my ears. It is certainly not being communicated here in Europe. I don't think that in Europe we are seeing this at all. But I would also say that I too have been becoming increasingly concerned that we are drifting towards some kind of intervention in Ukraine, because so many political reputations in Europe especially are now tied to this. Josep Borrell has talked about the need for Ukraine to win. Boris Johnson said that Russia must not only fail in Ukraine, but be seen to fail in Ukraine. The entire political class in Britain has endorsed that. And we have the most extraordinary recklessness. You were talking about the fact that we need in Britain to understand that the empire is gone. One of the most distressing, upsetting, dismaying things I've seen over the last year was a parliamentary debate we had in Britain when the United States finally pulled out of Afghanistan. And you had all those British MPs in the House of Commons standing up and saying that if the Americans went, we should have gone on alone. We should have gone on fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan by ourselves, cobbled together some kind of intervention force with the French. We don't need the Americans to do that. And I have to say, I did wonder at that point, what exactly are those people smoking? I mean, the idea that Britain can win a war in Afghanistan or Ukraine or anywhere without the United States is so completely ridiculous that our political class talks in that way absolutely disturbs me. But when you're dealing with that kind of mentality, I'm very much afraid that if Joe Biden says we need to send an intervention force into Ukraine, we need to declare a no-fly zone there, we need to do any one of these things, then I'm afraid he's going to be fully supported in Britain. And that really, really concerns me. And I can easily see how British politicians, German politicians, the Greens, the Green ministers in Germany, who must be deep down, they must be becoming increasingly worried because they can see what's happening in Germany. They can see how industry is now threatened with closure, how there's all the indications now of a major recession coming, not just a major recession, but a massive structural recession. You're seeing articles appearing in places like the Financial Times that Germany, through what it's done, has now created a structural problem of uncompetitiveness, because its energy bills are indefinitely going to be so much higher than in other industrial competitors. So the Greens, the Green Party, and some members of the Social Democrat Party, but the Greens especially, must be worried that the longer this goes on for, the greater the political danger for them. They may find that Germany will never vote the Greens into any governmental position again. And of course, given that that is for them the highest concern, and given that as members of the political class, as members of the elite, they are less concerned about the fate of their people because, well, as Robert was saying, that's not their priority. But I can easily see how if they hear the call from the Oval Office, they will jump for it and they will support it. And that will be a moment of incredible danger.
No doubt whatsoever. And I mean, I think, it was unimaginable because I think Biden instinctually, for all of his pro-war rhetoric over the years, has never been in a position where he would be held responsible for a war. I think he does have a cautious streak in him. And I think that's part of the reason for the escalating leaks about the grand jury investigation into Hunter, who's busy holed away next to a rehab in Malibu, and the Secret Service who got that sweet gig that, we need $1 million house to properly keep an eye on Hunter here in Malibu. Yeah. I lived in Malibu for many, many years. That's a sweet scam those Secret Service guys did. But I don't think that I'll give the reason why I think that they're escalating the leaks and the reason why I don't think they're willing to ultimately pull the trigger. I think they want Biden to behave in a certain way, and they want him to be even more aggressive than he has been. They think he's only been aggressive rhetorically and financially, and sending the arms over is basically like arms laundering. It's either internal arms laundering. Hey, let's get rid of a bunch of weapons so that we have a justification to buy a bunch of new ones. Or it's arms laundering in a more traditional way. Let's get these arms to places in the third world by shipments that just get misplaced on the way there. And no one will know the difference because Russia will claim to have blown them up anyway. And they've been shipped before. They've been shipped out of the country before they hit the railroad. Or, of course, that they're just getting or they're using Ukraine to do so. There have been stories about arms dealers all over Ukraine now for a while. There was even a social media one where they had a Ukrainian army guy selling weapons to the Donetsk Liberation Militia, which wouldn't surprise me at all if you understand how nuts Ukraine is right now with its combination of grifters and neo-Nazis and sociopaths. This is no surprise, the combination. But I think the deep state apparatus is, as you note, increasingly desperate. They see American military power and European military power as, but particularly American military power, frankly, about as a tool to use and as their ultimate tool against Putin. And since their economic sanctions are not working, their proxy war as a good military, I think it's called, he's Armchair Overlord on Twitter, former U.S. military guy, was doing a breakdown explaining how, from a NATO proxy war perspective, Ukraine actually has more manpower, more munitions, more weapons, a more difficult topography than Poland does. That it would be easier for Russia to invade Poland than it is to invade Ukraine. And if Ukraine is losing, it means NATO is really losing. It means NATO is witnessing that they would lose in a war against Russia without America's involvement, without American support. And so, but I think that Biden is sincerely hesitant to be blamed for dead bodies on his watch in that way. He has that old American instinct of no American casualties. He's not instinctively anti-war at all. His history shows otherwise, but he is instinctively opposed to him being held responsible for body bags. And I think the deep state apparatus doesn't like that. They want him to escalate. They want him to accelerate. They want not only no-fly zones, but they want troops on the ground. And they want, I don't know how they're going to get there given the issues with Turkey, but they probably want ships in the water. And so though I think you're right, Alexander, the Pentagon did not want that Russian ship to sink in the way that it did, because it may have implicated the Pentagon and other activities, so that we're officially not part of. I know of special ops teams that have been trained from the very beginning to be on the ground. And so when that French Le Figaro reporter said the Americans are actually running this war, this is a NATO war with the equivalent of NATO troops and NATO arms and NATO munitions, and in a place that they've been taught to hate the Russians even more so than the rest of Europe over the last 2 decades, with the various sort of narrative mythologies that became part of it. Just look at the number of statues in museums dedicated to Bandera, somebody who was unknown in Central and Eastern Ukraine at the time of his death. But in all the history there. But if you can't win in Ukraine, it means NATO can't win without American troops on the ground fully against Russia. That's how I think they would interpret it ultimately. And if their economic sanctions war isn't working, and it's clear to the people who are paying attention that it's not, then there's massive pressure to get Biden to leverage it. And the threat is, hey, we'll indict Hunter and unravel your whole family's corruption. And because he is sensitive to it, that Hunter's his last living son, his other son died, that unless you play ball with us. Now, the reason why I don't think they'll ever escalate to actually indict is because Biden is like Clinton in that he comes from the old Democratic political machine. It's the real reason Obama picked him. It wasn't because Biden's popular in middle America. That's never been true. The guy got crushed every time he tried to run for the presidency. Couldn't even get out of Iowa with any votes. Finished 4th this last time, in Iowa and New Hampshire. People up close, this guy doesn't sell well. Never did. Not as bad as Kamala Harris. She can't even keep a staff. 2/3 of them have already left. And they hate her so much they can't help that. They hate her as much as Amber Heard's personal assistant hates her in a recent trial. That's how much they hate Kamala. They just leak to Politico every time. Like this is, and I've always told people she's the dumbest lawyer I ever had to deal with in court. When she was Attorney General Cal, I mean, just dumb. She failed the bar the first time for a reason. I don't know who she Willie Brown to get past the second bar, but you know, it had to have been. But given that, I think there's the problem is if you actually go after Hunter, you implicate a wide range of Democratic political actors. Not only that, you implicate deep state actors. People should take a deeper look at who he was doing contracts with on behalf of those biolabs in Ukraine. That there's a lot of people with real power he did business for and was doing business on behalf of and doing business with. So they can't have the domino effect of allowing him to actually get indicted in a public trial, or at least a public trial. They could maybe get to indict, but they just can't go further than that. No. So that's why it's always kind of a bluff, a bit of an extortionate threat. People predicting he'll be indicted, I'll bet the bank against him being actually indicted. And it's sad, but it's like the Spygate stuff. I always said Durham would never go up the government chain. He may go up, some low-level people. He may do some people outside of government, like he is currently with the Sussman case that I believe the trial began this week. But he was never going to do James Comey, Jim Clapper, any Brennan, any of those people. He was never going to go after institutional guys. He was going to protect institutional guys. If you followed what he really did in Guantanamo and the CIA and the spying on the Senate and the torture there, you would know that was the roadmap more than the Mueller, more than the Boston, all of that Whitey Bulger stuff that he was also part of, because there he protected Mueller. Mueller was neck deep in that stuff. And so, I mean, he was in Boston, during an overlapping time period. People should have realized that wasn't a coincidence. So I think that the dynamic is such that there is massive pressure on Biden to move forward, and they're going to continue to escalate that. And I also think, to your point about Obama's appearance at the White House and how that went, originally I thought that's just Obama's ego, because one of the myths of the right here is that Obama is like a Hillary Clinton, that he's a grand planner, that he's running things behind the scenes, so on and so forth. If you read some of the deeper biographies of Obama and other people I've talked to about him, Obama's a split personality. His ego leads to him wanting to be in the public limelight, but his instinct is to just smoke pot and play video games. And that part can't be underestimated. I mean, it's the women in his life that have to drag him out politically, using his ego and narcissism. But he would rather just party with Richard Branson on Richard Branson's island. And Obama has cashed in huge. He and Michelle have really they've made that cash register just ring. They make the Clintons look like small change actors to how they've cashed in on the presidency. He's on every single corporate board. they're just writing checks for him to get there and talk and BS. But what was interesting about him, so I could see his ego and the rest. And I don't know if you saw the joke he made to Biden right in front of him, the White. I mean, that was kind of shocking. I mean, he gets up there and says, "I'd like to thank Vice President Harris. And I'd like to thank Vice President Biden." I mean, and you can tell Obama knew what an insult it was, because he walks over there and tries to console Joe. Oh, it's just a joke. But that's Obama. His ego is so big, and he has this mean streak, this nasty mean streak he can't hide. And he should have regretted it when he used it against Trump at that White House Correspondents' Dinner. Because Trump, that guaranteed Donald J. Trump was going to run for president in 2016. Yeah. You don't invite him to something and then insult him the whole time and him forget it. He was not going to forget. Never forgive, never forget, hold the line, as the old eternal truths go. But the way he handled that, it was one thing to make the joke, but to walk around with Kamala, so visually and introducing everyone to Kamala while little Joe's like, hey, I'm here. I'm right here behind you. I mean, it was sad, other than being sad and pitiful. Maybe actually kind of feel bad for Dementia Joe, just like that Easter Bunny thing where the Easter Bunny's grabbing him away from the kids. No, Joe, no, Joe. Is that it did suggest somebody behind the scenes did see using Obama in this way, whoever orchestrated him and Kamala walking along the line, as it's time for a transition, it's time for a handover, that Joe's no longer up to the task. He was supposed to do that great Kennedy-esque speech in Europe to rally everybody to take out Vladimir Putin, and instead it backfired with Europe saying, whoa, hold on, we're not supposed to say that publicly. So I think there may be some, but the problem is Kamala Harris is more hated than Joe Biden. Going into the midterms, having Kamala Harris be president would be a near disaster. And it'd be more interesting who she picked as VP. All I'll say is if she picked Hillary Clinton as her vice president, she should up her life insurance rather quickly, or the husband. So, but I think there's some risk of it, but we'll see.
I was reading comments by Elizabeth Warren about the midterms, in which she seemed to be dropping all sorts of criticisms of Nancy Pelosi as well. Do I get the sense that the Democrats are now becoming scared about the midterms, or is this wrong? And what's that going to make them do about the war? Will they escalate? Will they draw back? What will they do?
The lockdown was supposed to be popular. It wasn't. They convinced themselves it was popular, and then they had the Virginia and New Jersey shocks in the 2021. They lost the governorship of Virginia, lost a lot of key legislative seats, and then in New Jersey was what really shocked him. He almost lost to nobody, and so they did deep dives, they did focus groups, and the message that came out of that was get away from the lockdowns, just declare victory over COVID and go home. No more mandates, no more lockdowns. They just lost the mask mandate case in a major federal court case in Florida with a Justice Thomas clerk, who's now one of Trump's good appointees. His appointees in the district court much better than his Supreme Court appointees, frankly. And the CDC and the FDA folded, and the TSA folded and said no more mask mandate in the United States for the first time ever. And then there was all these videos because pilots announced it mid-flight, and you have all these social media videos of people cheering. And it's like, that should be a message to Democrats. Why are all these people on every single plane thrilled they no longer have to wear a mask? Hint, it's not popular, despite Philadelphia trying to impose a mask mandate as we speak. So that route isn't there. The economy was supposed to be booming. There were tons of people that predicted the economy was going to be great because you had this sort of induced recession of 2020. It was supposed to boom. I mean, Biden's still going around taking credit for the fact that we are no longer in lockdown stage. So look at all the jobs I've added, all the jobs that were part of the lockdown. Now, some of them have come back, not all of them. We're still not at the same labor force participation rate we were before the lockdown. The bigger problem is inflation, and that we don't have an easy cure economically. So so Democrats are looking at this and they're saying inflation isn't transitory, COVID isn't popular. We can't get anything through the Senate because of Manchin and Sinema. They're able to get a justice on the Supreme Court. We'll see how that translates for them, but it was just replacing Breyer. And so I think you look at all of these aggregations, they are deeply scared of the midterms. Right now, their internal estimates, I mean, Republicans are polling better in the generic ballot for the House of Representatives than they ever have in history. That's how bad it is. So you're talking about 60, 70, 80 seats in the House. You're talking about 3, 4, 5, 6 seats in the Senate. They may lose Nevada. They may lose Arizona. They may lose Ohio. They're going to lose Ohio. They may lose other states where they're trying to compete and not be able to pick up Pennsylvania or Michigan or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin like they thought. And they're definitely probably going to lose Georgia. So there's several seats they're guaranteed to lose. They might lose New Hampshire and some other places as well. And not only that, from a deep state perspective, it'll be the most populist ever elected to the House and the Senate since the 1920s. Those people like J.D. Vance, people like Blake Masters, people like maybe Eric Greitens out of Missouri, people like Adam Laxalt out of Nevada. These are all populist-leaning senators, very Trumpish in their positions. And so, and then the same in the House. There'd be more numbers-wise, but similar percentage. 20, 30, 40 people may join the Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Thomas Massey, Paul Gosar, populist wing. And so that they are terrified. That's a little bit scary because the more they believe they're going to lose against Russia and Ukraine, combined with they think they're going to get crushed in the midterms, leads them to want to take a high-risk gamble. Because it's like, what's the downside to them? The downside is they get crushed anyway. So there's almost no the risk reward is disproportionate. The risk is if they experience the same thing they're likely to experience anyhow, whereas which is a devastating defeat. Whereas the reward is maybe it temporarily salves the economy, maybe it temporarily distracts the masses, maybe it does a wag the dog, and it wags the dog long enough for them to, and that's the scary thing as to why we could get on the and when you see more and more people say how we could win a nuclear war, which these think tank type people and journalists are more and more, that makes it really terrifying.
Absolutely. How has it come about that we have all these people who are military experts, who, like the scientific experts we used to have at the time of the pandemic, who turned out to be, well, shall we say, mistaken, not perhaps experts? How has it suddenly appeared that we have all these people proliferating all over the place? Is this politicization of the military expert community? I mean, what's happened here? I mean, once upon a time, you would have expected people who have a sort of military background or military expertise to be the most honest in confronting power.
No doubt about it. I mean, I think it was fascinating watching the pandemic because you saw like all these people that jumped on being critical of these lockdown policies were people that a lot of them were apolitical initially.
Yeah.
You had the populist left and the populist right ultimately unite against it. With certain people, unsurprisingly, being ahead of the curve. People like Alex Jones were ahead of the curve, but on where the populist zeitgeist was going. And that's another guy like deeply anti-war and deeply opposed to further intervention. And I mean, Alex Jones has over 30 million people that rank him, have a very favorable rating of him in the United States. The political class sees him as a kook and a conspiracy guy and a tin. They don't understand he's more popular. There's a reason why Trump paid attention to what he was saying. And all the way through up to 2016. It's because he has his finger on the pulse of the populist base better than any substantial independent media person on the right. I mean, honestly, better than Rush Limbaugh did. If you paid attention to where Jones was going, you knew where the populist zeitgeist would be in 6 months better than if you were listening to Rush Limbaugh. Limbaugh was a close second, but he was behind Jones. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. But so given that, and you saw a whole bunch of data nerds join the anti-lockdown because of their expertise as data nerds, not because they were political, which was fascinating to watch. And they ended up being far more right than all our so-called medical experts, all our so-called PhDs and MDs and all the rest, and JDs along the way. You're seeing the same thing in the military context. Guys like this armchair overlord, guys like, we mentioned Jacob Dreisen, Jacob who's now putting up his report as a blog. A lot of these folks and a bunch of other people I follow, nice little podcast people, Russians with attitude who follow other people who Twitter try to temporarily ban. And they're just historical people, but they're providing tons of great information and intel, much better, much more accurate than the public media, military experts that are on Fox News, that are on Twitter, that are in social media, etc. And so it's been fascinating to watch because I can't believe personally. I know Milley went out there and said Russia's going to win in 72 hours and they'll take Kiev in 3 days. I can't believe Milley, or at least the analysts in the Pentagon, really believe that. There's no way. Like, if you look at some of what they were writing before the war, they were talking about how it'd be a protracted war, how Ukraine has had these built-up fortifications that actually the Soviets built up all the way back to the 50s and 60s and 70s. Places like that plant and Azovstal, which had all of its layers designed so that it could withstand bombing in a world war. All of nobody knew that better than the Russians. And then you add, look at the sieges of Kiev that have taken over time. The Russians are intimately aware of what has happened in those sieges of Kiev because they were sometimes the ones protecting it. And even when the city was much smaller, had less sophisticated protections, and say it was the Nazis raiding it, so they had no concern about civilian life or infrastructure, it still took forever for them to be able to seize Kiev, even when they had manpower advantage. So they thought they were going to take a city of 4 million with 50,000 troops in 72 hours. I just can't believe people at the base level of the Pentagon thought that. I get it was a convenient lie to spin to the press to set up false expectations. So when the Russians didn't get it, you'd say, see, all our spending on the Ukraine helps because they're able to win when they couldn't. But no honest military analyst that I knew sincerely believed that. But you had all these dimwits on social media, and I think it's because of how corrupted they've become. I can't believe most of them really believe it. There might be a few because we got some slow people at high levels of positions because of the politicization of the military. That's almost Soviet style politicization of the military, is that it has led to people who do not have an actual they didn't go through the ranks because of their skill. They rose through their ranks because of their politics. That's why we have a woke military at the top of the hierarchy, doing ads about women and trans and the military. It's like, what the heck? I mean, that's their mind. That's why you have Milley saying, I read about white rage because I'm deeply concerned about white rage. Matt, you want to look at some of the tattoos on some of the people we're supporting in Ukraine if you're
Mm.
concerned about, racially motivated rage. But so this is the kind of mindset mentality, and they cash in the defense industry. So this is the biggest boon to the defense industry in a long time, because this war is beautiful. You expend a bunch of munitions that don't even work. I mean, most of them are old, or they're going to get bombed into oblivion before they ever get to the front lines. Or if they get to the front lines, the Ukrainians have no use for them. Even Zelensky admitted this the other day. Said, I keep asking for weapons, and they send me weapons I didn't ask for, and we can't use. That's because they're not for you, Zelensky. The pounds of Colombian marching band that they're sending you, that's for you. But the weapons are not. The weapons are for them. So they have an excuse to either launder it to foreign places around the world off the books, or more importantly, to substitute locally. They're like, look at our need for munitions. We're running out here, folks. We got to put that defense military industrial complex on full scale blast. So I think that's part of what's happening is all these guys that are out there promoting the war are promoting weapons, right? That's what they're really doing. They're part of the defense industrial complex. They're going to say whatever they think the narrative needs to be to lead to more expenditure of weapons. Because if they came out and said, like Colonel McGregor has said, like Scott Ritter has said, or like people like Armchair Overlord, or just these other guys that are just randos on social media that understand military or military strategy history, or if you guys have talked about, if you understand deep, if you just come out and say, look, you're understanding deep battle policy, understanding the advantages in munitions and manpower of the Russians, understanding that the local population in the eastern part of Ukraine, this part of Ukraine, is pro-Russian, put those three facts together, it is only a matter of time before the Russian army achieves what they want militarily and geographically in the eastern part of Ukraine. And especially if they have no interest in going to Lviv or interest in going to Kiev, or interest of going west of the Dnieper River, other than maybe down to Odessa to seize the port, hold the Black Sea, and build a land bridge to Transnistria. If you understood that, how do you sell the war, right? How do you say, hey, let's just send munitions that serve no purpose? Let's send a bunch of weapons that can't even be effectively used. Let's waste $800 million a week while we're experiencing inflation. I mean, as you mentioned, it's very Vietnamish. The guns and butter strategy did not work. It led to the skyrocketing inflation that we never got control over, led to Bretton Woods 2, where we moved off of the gold standard to now creating the problems we have currently with the dollar. And it led to the stagflation of the 1970s that it took a decade or more to recover from. So yet that's basically being pitched to Biden. And it's a way around his budget problems. He can't get a budget through to increase the budget like he wants for Build Back Better and all that other jazz through the Senate. But he can for arms right now. So it could be, he could get a bunch of arms factories and get a bunch of jobs and get other things working in the defense industry. The old Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan compromise, which was massive domestic investment through the military. That's why Reagan and Tip O'Neill cut that deal. And it was part of why the Republican base was going to fall apart later on, because without that defense industry, where were the jobs for those people? But it can be that's the escape valve potentially for Biden is further intervention. And I think the reason why we're seeing these military experts get exposed, like I don't know if you saw Malcolm Nance, the MSNBC military expert, he's over in Ukraine now. He doesn't even know how to put a gun on. He doesn't even know how to, he has the gun strap in the wrong place. He has the safety off. That guy's going to start shooting random people. But these are the idiots that are defense experts who I love being exposed. They're all being exposed, especially when you get exposed by some rando on Twitter that nobody knew about 3 months ago. It's a beautiful thing.
It sounds like. Go on, Robert.
Yeah, no, and so I think that's the. It's because of their corruption in the defense industrial complex is 80% of it. And because I think most of them know they're lying. I can't believe that they're this dumb. You'd have to totally not know military history, World War II history, Russian military strategy. You'd have to not know any of those things to believe the nonsense they've been spewing. Some clearly do spew it because they sincerely believe it. And that's a reflection of the incompetence of our political hierarchy in the military. I mean, that's why they were so anti-Trump. Somebody like Milley was secretly conspiring with Pelosi against the existing president and promising to talk to the Chinese before he talked to others. Just treasonous, actual treasonous type behavior. or seditious behavior, unlike what happened on January 6th. But but otherwise, I think they just got caught lying, and the whole world's getting to see it. Just as they're seeing how the doctors and the medical experts are mostly about grabbing power and sticking profits in their pockets on behalf of the big pharma companies that they've been compromised by. The same is true of our military experts, who are basically deep state apparatchiks, who enrich themselves. I mean, that's what they all want to do. They want to get to retirement age, get their nice government pension, and then really cash in the defense industry. This is what Eisenhower meant about be wary of the military-industrial complex.
Absolutely. It sounds like medical experts who work for Big Pharma and military experts who work for the military-industrial complex. They're basically highly paid salesmen. They're not experts in any true sense at all, because an expert has to have scientific, and in the military case, military integrity. And these people self-evidently don't. So, I mean, that's a very disturbing thing, because, of course, without experts, one can't really, if you're a government, you can't actually decide what to do, because, well, you ultimately do need expert advice. I mean, you can have your finger on the pulse of, the American people, but you do need sometimes that technical advice that experts give. But if the experts are bought, then, and that advice is compromised, it becomes far more difficult to actually make decisions. Just a few things. I mean, we've been saying, you made these comparisons with the events of the 60s and the 70s and the inflation there. We've been making this point repeatedly on the Duran, that to somebody like myself who lived through the late 60s and the 70s, it feels like an extraordinary replay. I mean, I even hear some of the same rhetoric. I mean, I was always going to say the same people, but of course, Joe was around in 72, but I think he's about the only person who was. But I don't remember him from that time. But anyway, I mean, it is extraordinary to see how things have gone completely round. But can I also say about that, which is that in the 60s and 70s, the fabric, the industrial economic fabric of the United States was stronger than it is today. And what the United States could carry in the 60s and 70s, today, if this is pushed too far, can do much more serious damage. And that is something that really does worry me, because you talk about China. Of course, there was no real competitor to the United States in terms of economic power in the 60s. China today is such a competitor. And I think, that these people who are playing these games with the United States, who are talking about involving the United States directly in a war in Europe, a war of choice against Russia, a nuclear power, there's only one country that could conceivably benefit from that. I'm not saying that they want it to happen like that, but the only country that could conceivably benefit from it is China. And just as China ultimately was, it seems to me, the big winner of the geopolitical changes of the 70s and 80s and 90s, so it would be so all over again, and for the same reasons, because of bad decisions made ultimately in Washington. So that would be, I think that's something that Americans need to consider and to think about. Well, since you are an expert, can I ask you a question, Robert, which has been intriguing me? I've seen a bubble, somebody else asking it, which is now that the Russians are talking about bringing legal challenges about the fact that their reserves have been stolen and all those sort of things. I think that in theory, there might be a legal case. I think the practical difficulties of bringing it are going to be immense. Any thoughts?
So, yeah, a couple of components. I mean, it's definitely the case. There have been plenty of suits. Deripaska, I may be getting his name mispronounced, but he filed suit over the sanctions issued against him in the States. So there's been, now, the problem you run into is, as you note, the political hurdle. A recent federal judge ruled against a Russian on sanctions, and he concluded by quoting the brave men at Snake Island. So, this is what you get for federal judges in America, sadly.
Yeah.
They didn't even know. This was after it had been exposed. The Snake Island was the hoax and nobody got wiped out and none of that, happened. They said F you right before they said, and now we surrender. That's what happened.
Yeah.
But that is the hurdle. But legally, there are constitutional constraints on the so in the past, sanctions issues have given rise to First Amendment claims because maybe you're targeting someone for speech reasons or the right to petition the government or the right to assembly or the right of religious expression. My view is it has Second Amendment implications. That has not happened in the sense of self-defense context. They can steal your property without certain notice. I think that triggers self-defense rights, but that's another issue. Fourth Amendment issues, because it's searching and seizing property without probable cause of a crime. Fifth Amendment issues, not only right to due process, but takings without just compensation. And so in each of those issues, there's different rules that apply depending on whether you're a U.S. citizen or not.
Yeah.
My understanding is Russia's looking at bringing its own legal action. It's kind of interesting. I assume that they were going to have U.S. bondholders take the action. They are both more politically sympathetic and have a legally more substantial position. Because the problem is none of these deprivations of property. Because what happened was once the obligation to pay was triggered, legally there's a good argument that the property right has now shifted. This is no longer the property right claim of the Russian government. This is now the property right claim of the person who was owed the money. Because only once that debt becomes due and they didn't get paid. Apparently they got paid in rubles, but they didn't get paid in dollars as the contract required, as the original bondholding contract required. So they have potential claims against the bank on the grounds that the bank is as tortiously interfering with them. The bank is going to rely upon on indirect sovereign immunity on the grounds that this is a state demanded action. The problem is the law doesn't clearly immunize them in that way. And the second problem for the government, for suing the U.S. Treasury, OFAC gets into these disputes several times a year because we keep escalating our use of sanctions. We went from almost no sanctions prior to World War II to we sanction everybody now. We kind of put sanctions, but it was more like an embargo on Japan and parts of Germany. But sanctions was really a post-World War II phenomenon. By the way, random side point, that populist senator from Ohio, Bob Taft, was one of the lead votes against the United States joining NATO because he said this is just going to lead to trouble. Just watch. He turned out to be prescient. But the people like J.D. Vance knew that history. But so I think legally, bondholders definitely have a claim. It's a little bit tricky since they were paid in rubles rather than dollars. They were paid, but they can and now the ruble has equal value. I think it's actually higher than it was before the war started. So much for that strategy so far. Though, by the way, internally here, like on their Twitter feeds, they think it's just a matter of days before the Russian economy still collapses. If you go to Drudge Report, which Matt Drudge, for people that don't know, sold that years ago, it was secretly sold. It's still secretly sold because they didn't want to diminish the brand. But Drudge has had nothing to do with it for years. If you go to their front page, you'll see coup right about to happen. Russia's, Putin's so scared he's locking up all the few admirals and generals that haven't been killed in the war. He's locking them up. The economy is just about to implode. That the Russian central bank just did some manipulation, which I find funny coming from the West, talking about central bank manipulation. Okay, but they just did some funny business, and it's just about to collapse. All that kind of stuff. But I think given those issues, the bondholders can still bring suit because they were paid in dollars. And there's probably issues with converting the ruble. I'm not sure how much there is, but there probably is some issue in the States. And then the Russian government can bring an action on the grounds because this is the seizure of property that was located within the United States, which gives it constitutional jurisdiction. And remember, they said immigrants they said non-citizens from foreign nations could sue Trump over the so-called Muslim ban. So if they could sue, I don't know how Russia can't sue, but here the property's here. So property's here, they can sue over. And the question is whether we complied with constitutional restrictions. We did not. This did not go through any constitutional process. There's also an argument about whether the jury trial rights apply to the seizure of property in this context, which is a Sixth Amendment issue. Is that because the property is here, that gives a legal right to certain constitutional restrictions to apply. Now, the hurdle has been in many of these cases, they've settled often. The OFAC is what they've done. Is the cases get fully litigated, they settle. They usually like the cases because they use it as a discovery exploration, and which they want because of the I very rarely have country suit. It's almost always been an individual, and so there's information they wanted to know about that individual. They let him suing over sanctions be their excuse, because in America, unlike Europe, our discovery procedures are incredibly invasive. In Europe, the court system is such that there's strong limits on what you can discover. Not in the States. You can discover almost anything, even if it's inadmissible evidence, you can discover it. But that wouldn't probably apply as much to the Russian government claim.
No.
So I think their hurdle will be politics. I think legally they're right. This was property seized without due process of law, clearly, constitutionally. You could argue certain treaties that may be applicable. And so I think that's my short answer. Yes, there are claims. Russia would be much better off if American bondholders were the ones bringing those claims, though.
I entirely agree. I should say that I was reading the statement that Nabulina, who is the central bank chair in Russia, was making. And she says that they're going to really, really look at whether or not they can bring legal claims. But she's not, she's not unaware of the enormous difficulties. I'm entirely of the view that it should be left to the bondholders. And I think it'd be potentially extremely embarrassing, because on the face of it, and all that you've said has reinforced this view, I think these are very strong claims. I mean, yes, these people have been paid in rubles, but it is extremely difficult if you are paid in rubles and you're in the West to convert those rubles into dollars now, because you run up, as I understand it, against a whole new layer of sanctions. Where do you convert your rubles? Which bank is going to convert it for you?
Exactly. And the other problem is political paranoia. We've had so many self-sanctions. So many of these Western is the reason why oil froze for a while, in the sense of transport. There were a bunch of Russian ships around with oil around, and no one would dock them. Even though they weren't even subject to sanctions, they were explicitly exempted from the sanctions. Didn't matter. And that's, I mean, look at all the U.S. companies that have virtue signaled because they care more about cultural hegemonic influence than they do about economic self-enrichment. I mean, that's how nuts these places are. Ultimately, that's going to be their own stockholder issues. But that's the other. I mean, the people that voluntarily left the Russian market, in my view, violated their obligations to maximize shareholder profit to their shareholders and breached their fiduciary obligations. The Twitter board might be learning about that soon as they try to keep Elon Musk from making Twitter free for everybody in terms of free speech. But yeah, I agree with you. Much stronger to bring that claim on behalf of an American bondholder. And it was the reason why a lot of us thought that we were skeptical that the Treasury would really go through with all this. Because if people look at that list, there's going to be there's going to be people with real political juice on that bondholder list. I mean, there's some big pension funds that had Russian bonds. And so are they going to screw over your ordinary pensioner? I mean, so we always thought they would release the funds for those payments. Maybe not anything else, but at least those payments. Because that's who they're stiffing right now. And again, it's not done in a constitutional or legal manner. But I think it'd be much harder. The other problem for the Russian government, if they bring suit, what lawyer is going to represent them?
Well,
I mean, lawyers are terrified to get anywhere near them.
Yeah, we said exactly the same thing today in a program that we did. I mean, it would be almost impossible for the Russian government to find legal representation in London now. Whether it be any easier in the US, I really don't know. I remember this happened during the Skripal case, by the way, when the Russians were trying to find a law firm that would represent them in attempts to reach out to the Skripals, to meet with the Skripals, to get consular access to the Skripals as they're entitled to under international law, under the Vienna Convention. And the word went out from Whitehall that no law firm that was, concerned about its future would agree to act for the Russians in that kind of case. I have to say, I was profoundly shocked that happened. I mean, depriving a party of a right to legal representation. I mean, I never thought such a thing would ever happen. I mean, the implications of it are terrifying, but it did happen. I mean, I know it did happen. And I wonder whether it would be any different in the US at this time, even if you didn't have, people going out and actually warning people not to represent. But I wonder whether there would be any, law firm capable of running this kind of case that would be prepared to take it.
And you have to deal with all the sanctions issues, and you see with all the election fortification lawyers, they were all subject to a wide range of ethics, punitive actions. So I'll say I do know a lawyer who might take it if you have a lifetime of Cuban cigars and a Dutch in the Black Sea to offer.
We won't inquire too closely in an open program as to who he is or she is.
But yeah, I think it'll be sadly a whereas American bondholders will have no problem. I mean, these are some powerful pension funds, some big investment groups.
I entirely agree. Let's since we've got you and we're talking about legal subjects, because there's all sorts of legal subjects. Now, when we had our last live stream, and I don't know how much time you have, Robert, but you were somebody who was who takes an interest in preemptive law, preemptive war. That if a country perceives a real and present danger to its security, to its survival, even, that it has a right in that sort of case to act preemptively. And I think that there is actually good legal authority for this. I mean, you have case law actually going back, I think, back to the 19th century, which says that you can do it. But of course, this is contested and disputed by some people. And of course, it's the argument that the Russians are making, that basically Putin was making at the commencement of this war. I mean, what is your views about this? I mean, I think you are sympathetic to these kind of arguments. Is this right?
Absolutely. I mean, I see it as self-defense extended, and I think the state might have broader obligations of self-defense and broader rights related thereto than even the individual. And so I see it as, would you have a right of self? So, like, let's say I knew my neighbor across the street had a plan to shoot me, was putting that plan into place. Do I have a right to take preemptive action before he shoots me, or do I have to wait until he's got the sniper rifle right on my head? My view is I don't have to wait until he's got the sniper rifle on his head. Now, that is disputed even within American case law as to how imminent the threat has to be before you can exercise self-defense. I'm for a broad, robust, practical rule. I'm also for, I like laws that are that you can get most people to follow. I'm not a big fan. Like, I'm not a big fan of labeling everything. Like a lot of my anti-war friends on the left are. Everything's a war crime. Going to war is a crime. Every politician's a war criminal. It's like, well, by that point, you've so watered it down that nobody's going to care about actual war or real more horrendous war crimes because you've so diluted it that nobody follows it. A law that no one will follow is not really a law at all. And so I like practical standards. And so I also think this self-defense fits within most civilized nations' history of conduct. Because if we impose too much of a limit on when you can wage war, no one will follow that limit, and then it's a useless limit. Whereas I think you can create manageable standards that deter the worst actions while immunizing actions that are understandable. So my view of... I don't believe in preventative war, but I do believe in preemptive war. But I do think the risk, the only legal components I would superimpose upon it is it has, like in the U.S., for self-defense, it needs to be objectively reasonable. So you don't have the crazy person problem to say, hey, I see a threat when there isn't objectively reasonableness for that threat to be there. And I think that threat needs to be reasonably imminent. Doesn't have to be tomorrow, but it can't be 20 years from now. I think they might have nukes and do something to us. Kind of like the Israeli argument towards Iran. It's like, that seems a little attenuated in terms of the risk profile. So I think it doesn't need to have to be as imminent as American law often requires for individuals, and I haven't ever agreed with that. As a practical matter, none of us would do it, is the way I see it. Any ordinary person who objectively, reasonably believes that person plans to kill them across the street, I think can take preventative action to preclude that from happening. They don't have to wait for, okay, it's 2 seconds away, it's 4 seconds away, it's 8 seconds away. And I see the same principle as to countries. But I don't agree with preventative war, but I do agree with preemptive war. You're definitely right. Most international legal scholars say there has to be an actual invasion or an actual imminent risk that you can't do preventative war. But in the U.S., that's why I couldn't understand some of these people on Fox. I mean, Sean Hannity even said it. Isn't it always a war crime when a sovereign nation militarily attacks another one? Are you saying this with a straight face? Have you missed the 80 countries we've militarily intervened in since 1960? I mean, come on. Unless I want to lock up my own people, my own historical ancestors, I can't take that position credibly or consistently. So I think preventative war, yes. And then the question is, was it objectively reasonable for Russia to see what was happening in Ukraine as an imminent risk at some level to their security and safety? Now, what's developed since the war has enhanced his arguments in the sense of the bioweapons labs, the degree of what was happening in the Donbass region, the degree of what some of the plans were afoot to take back Crimea, which there's these idiots, these Twitter generals are still talking about doing. He has more evidence for that than before. But yeah, I generally think, if there had been real weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and there had been solid evidence that it was imminently intended to be used against Americans, I don't have a problem with the Iraqi war. And that's where I disagree with a lot of my left friends. Problem is, those two statements were lies, and we knew they were lies, or had reason to know they were lies. But that's basically it's close to the American take, but not as aggressive. I mean, America's current legal take is you can go in if your security interests are anyway implicated. You can go in if there's a treaty between you and the other country. That doesn't fit my definition of self-defense, but closer to the American view than the international view.
Yeah, and it is always important when drawing up laws that the laws have to reflect the reality of actual life. So if countries are going to take actions to defend themselves against what they see as imminent threats, then trying to outlaw that is unrealistic to the point where it can actually undermine any concept of law governing international relations in wartime and about war at all. And I think that's an important principle, actually, and it also applies, I think, an awful lot to to law as it affects everyday life. I mean, if you are somebody who feels themselves in danger, you have a right to protect yourself. And if the law says you don't, and you as a result suffer injuries and death, well, what's going to happen is ultimately, if that becomes established, then it's the law that will fail, not because people will say the law doesn't work any longer. So I always think, as I said, that law has to reflect the realities, the practical realities of everyday life. What I personally think is an abomination is this responsibility to protect doctrine, this idea, which is one we've seen originating in Britain, by the way. Tony Blair sprung it on us. Samantha Power adopted it, that countries have some kind of duty to intervene militarily in other countries, not because they feel threatened by those countries, but because they see some kind of moral duty to do so, because they find something that is going on within those countries to be objectionable. Now, that for me is an abomination. That's a horror. That is something that leads to absolute disaster. But countries taking steps to defend themselves, as you rightly said, if it can be objectively established, I think that that's a very strong case. And I actually think that is probably, I'm not an international lawyer, but from what I've seen of international law, I think that's probably something you could establish on the basis of the precedents that's probably a legal position that jurists would probably come around to accepting eventually. I don't know what you think about all of that, Robert.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, where I disagree with Russia, even though I understand where they're trying to go at it, is that no combatant immunity under the prisoner of war principles under the Geneva Convention can apply if you're neither a national of Ukraine nor part of their regular armed forces, because the Geneva Convention was designed in Russia, of all people. I don't agree with all of what Professor Turley said on this point, because he adopted a lot of the mythology of Fox News about what was happening in the war. But and he could have been much more detailed, because this has been an extensively discussed topic within the international legal community.
Yes.
But it is often the case. I mean, you're allowed to be identified as a prisoner of war, even without being part of any military structure of a country, if it's the equivalent of like a self-defense type action. In other words, you're invaded, it's your town, you go get a gun, it's your only option, you defend yourself. You're supposed to, you get combatant immunity, not just all the protections of prisoner of war treatment, but the biggest one is combatant immunity. You cannot be legally charged with a crime by the people that hold you, that keep you as a prisoner of war, as long as you meet the definition of a lawful combatant under the Geneva Convention. And that is not limited to being officially in the army. It just requires, it covers volunteers, it covers militia groups, it covers anybody, even covers people totally outside of the army if it's their only means of self-defense at the time in defending their local area. The Russians, by the way, have used mercenaries and used volunteer operations throughout its history, both during the Soviet Union and afterwards. So they should not be rushing to embrace. I get why they're sending this message. They want to. There is a convention against training and recruiting mercenaries, and clearly the Western governments are circumventing that. You know, Boris is officially saying don't go, but then other people are saying wink, wink. Would be great if you did.
Yeah.
I mean, a couple of Brits just got captured in Mariupol, and so I get why they're saying this. They want to say, hey, we're going to treat you like a common criminal if you are not from Ukraine and come to this battle. But legally, I don't think they can. Under the Geneva Convention, if there's even a dispute about it, they have to presume they have legal immunity until a competent court rules otherwise. And I think so far what I'm seeing, almost all these mercenaries are under some form of Ukrainian military command. And so then they're completely protected. Now, they're not protected for things they did outside the law and custom of war. So Nuremberg-style offenses, they can still be criminally prosecuted for. And by the way, I think Putin plans on a Nuremberg too. I think he plans on putting all of these people on international trial. Will not try to make it look like a Soviet or Cuban Castro-style show trial. He'll want it to look like Nuremberg did. He'll look a lot better than the International Criminal Court Milosevic did. He wants to put all these people on trial, and for that he can put them on trial while still giving them lawful combatant protection. I think it's a mistake to actually not. I mean, again, they may be saying this for PR purposes, not going to follow through, but I think it's a mistake for them to say legally and ultimately politically to say they're not going to treat mercenaries as lawful combatants.
I have to say I completely agree. I think you're entirely correct. I mean, again, I've been following this thing about mercenaries. It's been, this discussion has existed, as you rightly said, for a long time. It was going all the way back to the 70s. I can remember people talking about what the rights of mercenaries were in conflicts. I think you've stated the position absolutely correctly. That's entirely my own view. I think that even if this was a political move by the Russians to scare people away, I think it was probably a bad and wrong thing to do. And I think it is a mistake, actually. I think if they do intend to hold war crimes trials of their own, then I think what they need to do is to show that they are themselves observing the Geneva Conventions. And that means treating these combatants, these mercenaries, these volunteers, as they may be in some cases, appropriately, according to international law, to war crimes law, to the conventions as well. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I saw Turley's tweets. I too thought that he was getting some of the facts wrong, but I think on the underlying legal points, I think he's absolutely right. And I agree with him, and I agree with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, it'd be interesting to see how. Go on.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I mean,
didn't mean to interrupt.
Now, I was going to say one other transition topic. You mentioned earlier the biggest profiteer from all this is China. The other place the deep state apparatus, Biden's folks, etc., may be looking for an actual military conflict is rather than try to battle the Russians in Ukraine, actually provoke China to do something towards Taiwan. I mean, there's talk we're going to arm Taiwan. There's Nancy Pelosi was going to take a visit to Taiwan until all of a sudden she got the coof right after the Chinese objected. All of a sudden she was like, now that I think about it, I'm sick. And And I mean, that whole Pelosi comes from the old Democratic political machine. Her dad, like the
Mm.
Biden style machine, her dad was a big political machine guy in Baltimore, which reflect all the underlying dynamics with Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
Kamala Harris came up attached to Willie Brown. You had all these Democratic factions in San Francisco, still fascinating. You had the Feinstein machine, you had the Pelosi machine, which includes Gavin Newsom, and then you had the Willie Brown machine. And these were nationally powerful political machines. And Feinstein has been one of the people that's been more, let's not get into a war with China. Now, of course, she had a chauffeur that ended up being connected to some interesting people, but that's another story. And of course, Chinatown is in San Francisco. But these aside from the internal San Francisco politics and how that bleeds over into all this, one alternative, and Milley seemed to suggest this. Milley said that he was suggesting he was suggesting a two-war front implicitly. He said our two great enemies are Russia and China in a recent presentation to Congress. And you see this escalation, not only in all the political rhetoric, in which has only triggered the Chinese officials to be harder. They're sending out memes with America putting a gun to their head. I mean, very aggressive language and rhetoric for China to utilize. Their position is hardening, not softening. And then there's talk that we might arm Taiwan. I think it's even more nuts. Well, it's about as nuts, I suppose, as going to war with Russia. But it may be the alternative is to shift to Taiwan. They might think they may have more sympathy there because there's historically more people paid more attention to Taiwan in the States than they have to Ukraine. Now, it's still a minority of people, but there is still more of a concern raised there. What do you think the prospects of that are? I mean, it strikes me as insane, but going to war with Russia over Ukraine strikes me as insane.
Well, absolutely. Well, can I just say, I mean, I think it would be insane. I think it would be completely insane. But can I just say something? I think that the political leadership in Washington, I think, misunderstood many of the signals coming out of Moscow. They were warned. I remember the Russian ambassador said, do not underestimate our resolve. I don't think they understood that. I don't think they understood the resilience of the country that they're coming up against, the fact that the Russians see this as an existential issue for them as a nation. And I think this was something that was not understood in the United States by the leadership there. I'm afraid they're making exactly the same mistake about China and Taiwan. It's slightly different there because I think that this is very much, in terms of China, a question of the position of the regime. And I think that the regime in China, the Communist Party, the CCP, I think would be seriously concerned about its prospects of survival if Taiwan were to achieve essential and real independence of China, if it were to break away. And I think that the CCP would definitely fight to prevent that happening. And I've been reading Chinese media, and I want to stress again, when I say I read Chinese media, somebody brought this up recently on a comment somewhere. I don't read them to get news. I read them to see what the Chinese are saying about news. I've never known
it's the same reason I read the New York Times.
Exactly. I've never seen the Chinese to be as angry and as confrontational and, if you like, as belligerent as they are now. And I did a program recently on my channel in which I was, from Global Times. They were quoting all these military officials, the military official who was in the military district that would be engaged in the fighting in Taiwan if there were ever a fight there, the spokesman of the Ministry of Defense in Beijing, the Foreign Ministry spokesman, and they were breathing fire. And I think that this is not something that one should think is bluff. And I think if people like General Milley think it is, I think that we are running huge risks, greater risks even than we would be in Ukraine. And I say why I think that, because I think the Russians ultimately would want to see some sort of compromise. I mean, in the sense that there was a war in Ukraine involving the United States. The Russians if they achieve their objectives, would want to find a way for the United States to retreat. And I explain why. Because Russia is not as strong as China is. It's not as strong as the US is, not in aggregate. And they want to keep these two powers there in balance. They don't want to have a situation where the US is defeated, retreats into its shell, removes itself entirely from the geopolitical landscape, because at that point, Russia is left facing China on its own. And they may be the best of friends, but in that kind of situation, the risk is China becomes over dominant and Russia then becomes clearly dependent on China. So, from the Russian point of view, having a balance between these two powers, even if their alliances are with China at the moment, suits them, because that means that the Chinese feel, for one thing, that they need the Russians, and that gives the Russians something, some maneuver space with the Chinese in the future. The Chinese don't think like that. If there is going to be a war in the Pacific over Taiwan, the Chinese will not give the Americans, the United States, the same. They won't be prepared to give the United States the same kind of off-ramp. And that means that the potential for escalation and disaster is much greater.
And I think it came out today. They publicly confirmed they finalized the deal with the Solomon Islands, at least from something I saw.
Yeah.
So and the other thing also is I don't think China would be as restrained as Russia has been, in the sense they don't care about Taiwanese infrastructure, the Taiwanese people, to the degree that Russia was trying to avoid those problems in Ukraine, in part for rebuilding it, but also I think for public opinion perspectives, whereas China could care less. I think. And so that could be much more brutal, much quicker, much nastier, much faster in ways that are problematic. Some people had asked about Gonzalo Lira. I don't have any update unless you guys have any update.
No.
What I would say is that, I get people have, he had different controversies in his past and whatnot. But in terms of this particular involvement in Ukraine, I was explaining to people the other day that you have to understand his Chilean roots. As to some people asked why take the risk that he took. If you'd grown up in Chile, if you had family that experienced the Pinochet regime, and all of Latin America had dictators at one type or another in the post-Cold War era, most of them instituted either directly or with the aid of the collusion of the United States. One of the tactics taken in Latin America was these disappearances. And it was not just to disappear the person, to remove them from the civil society and remove their advocacy and remove the efficacy of their advocacy, but it was psychological torture. It was terrorism on the broader population. You never knew what happened to your son, your husband, your loved one. You never knew. And it just visited vicious psychological effect on the population, which many still remember. And as Gonzalo had said, he grew up in that and experienced that and understood it from his relatives and others. And he took a very bold and brave position by staying in Ukraine, because the reason for those disappearances was to intimidate and suppress dissent. And he chose to continue to voice that dissent because he wanted to remove the incentive by which they were disappearing people in populations. And so what I encourage to everybody out there, your congressman, your senator, your State Department, your media people, particularly these people that want to promote the war, put a little Ukrainian flag in their thing, but to everybody else politically and publicly, just to ask, where is Gonzalo Lira? And just keep asking it and keep asking it and keep asking it. Because whatever people disagree or whatever, what happened 2 years ago or 3 years ago when Coach Red Pill or whatever, the bottom line is he took a very brave, very bold, very noble stand by standing up against this act of disappearing people. And all of the fans of Ukraine in this conflict should ask themselves, how is it even possible that somebody that's just voicing their opinions on YouTube could be subject to the risk of disappearance if this regime is anything like what the Western press has told you this is? The reality is we have unleashed some of the most vicious, vile evils in the history of our foreign policy, and we've done it all on scale in Ukraine. We'll have disappearance of opposition, arrest. I mean, here you have the Ukrainian president showing his lead opponent around. Hey, look who I have sitting in my basement.
Yeah.
Look at who I have sitting in my dungeon. The continued acts of bloggers being threatened with 15-year prison sentences for treason, for simply voicing skepticism of the war. And we have fake journalists who are really deep state operatives. One of them lives in Las Vegas, interestingly enough. This trans individual who somehow is a journalist in Kharkov. Ask yourself how that happens. And you dig deeper, and they're connected to the Daily Beast. They were part of disinformation operations connected to the Proud Boys and the Republican Party. Ask yourself how that person's in Kharkov. But it, was bragging about hoping for the disappearance of Gonzalo. That's the mindset out there with all these people retweeting this individual. This is a horrific mindset where we were seeing open, overt racial, ethnic discrimination. Boston Marathon said no Russians or Belarusians allowed. This is just absurd. This is insane. But we have celebrated the deepest, darkest aspects of American foreign policy. And Gonzalo Lira's story at this point is symbolic of that. And rather than speculate on what has happened or where he is, the best way to defend him and protect him and what he stood for in this context is to ask all these power brokers, including embassy in Chile, the U.S. embassy, he's a U.S. citizen and a Chilean citizen, just the 4 questions. Until they answer it, where is Gonzalo Lira?
Gonzalo Lira,
the only update that I have is that the embassy of Chile in Poland is well aware as to the concern, and they are working to figure things out. And for those who don't know, the embassy of Chile in Poland is the embassy that is in charge of the region, and Ukraine is one of the countries that they are in charge of. So that is the one confirmation that I do have. In other words, all the embassies around the world, thanks to everybody that contacted their local embassy or their consulate or the representative office, they ended up contacting the Chilean embassy in Poland. The Chilean embassy in Poland has been flooded with messages and calls, whether it's from people or from other embassies in Chile, and they have told all those people who have been getting in contact with them that they know exactly what's going on, not with Gonzalo Lira, but this whole narrative, this whole story, and they're trying to figure it out. So they are, for lack of a better word, you could say they're working the case.
And
the other people, that's what we know.
Everybody should reach out to are these Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, these organizations that had a noble history, that took George Soros money over the last 2 decades, that frankly abandoned their nonpartisanship, in my view. I was a patron of these organizations for many years, but it became clear that they were an extension of Western NGOs. Also reach out to all of them, because this is what they're supposed to be here for. They're supposed to be here for human rights circumstances just like this, for the disappearance of people who are just voicing their opinion. That's an important point, just voicing their opinion on the conflict. If the Ukrainian Zelensky structure wasn't as deeply corrupt as Gonzalo said it was, he would not be in, and we would not be in the situation that we're in. So I encourage everybody to reach out to them as well, because it's time for those organizations to prove that they are capable of being independent, capable of being apolitical, protection of human rights organizations, and they can prove it by public advocacy for figuring out what has happened to Gonzalo Lira.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I used to be a very strong supporter of amnesty, and I too have become very embittered by the way it has departed from its roots. But if it has any loyalty left to them at all, then if there's anybody from Amnesty listening, and I know sometimes there is, by the way, don't ask why, but if there is, please listen to what Robert just said and do what you can in this situation. Certainly, the authorities in Kiev, the authorities in Kharkiv would not want Amnesty to criticize them, not at this time.
Absolutely. And some of these people, like, I was shocked at the Washington Post story where American big tech companies are using facial recognition software and deep mining social media data to help Ukrainian units identify dead Russian soldiers for the purpose of contacting their mothers and showing them the picture of their dead sons on the battlefield.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is morally horrifying conduct.
Yes.
But what these companies should remember
Yeah.
is this is also illegal conduct.
You're right.
In the one, you can enforce a range of Nuremberg Code provisions, Geneva Code provisions. A range of these are enforceable in U.S. courts. There's that part, including against foreign nationals. I mean, they should have figured this out from the FIFA issue, right? How is it we're indicting people in New York? We're indicting foreign people for taking foreign bribes related to a foreign organization because we claim jurisdiction across the board in a lot of these cases. Now, I'm not for that expansive definition of jurisdiction, but I'll take advantage of it if it's given. And that means right to sue Ukrainians and other people for bad acts they do in Ukraine on behalf of people who are connected to victims of that. But it's definitely the case that U.S. companies engaging in outrageous conduct commit the tort of intentional infliction of emotional distress, conspiracy to commit that tort, aiding and abetting that tort, an accessory to that tort, for which they can be sued in any state in the United States. And if these companies continue to provide this assistance, when they know what it's being used for, is broadcast on the front pages of the Washington Post, which I find this morally horrifying, that they're, using your technology so you can call and basically mock a Russian mother, look at your dead son. This is horrifying conduct. That I see people justifying this is unbelievable. It's like these people should look in the mirror at how insane they have become. They have looked into the pit and seen the monster and become the monster. But these companies should know they will be and can be legally sued, and there'll be lawyers like me that will take those suits solely to make the point, because this is deeply disturbing behavior by big tech companies in America.
Absolutely.
Well said. Well said.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said, Robert. I have to say, I found it horrifying. I found it obscene. I didn't know the full extent of the legal transgressions. Sometimes one knows something is utterly wrong and one doesn't necessarily realize that it's also illegal too, because it doesn't always follow that because something is horrifying, it's illegal. But in this case, it's clear that it is, and in the most basic way. We don't have these kind of laws, I suspect, to the same extent in Britain, because we depend too much on judge-created privacy law here. We do have data protection laws, but anyway, that's another story entirely. But privacy law in Britain is judge-created and, frankly, rather disastrous. It's a complete mess, at least in my opinion.
Well said. Gentlemen, 2 hours, 30 minutes.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Well, a wonderful program. Amazing.
Amazing.
Yeah, thanks
program.
for all the. By the way, Alexander, are you Makoris? Is that the Makoris family from Greece?
Absolutely. She was, if you're thinking about Melina, she was my aunt and my very good friend. I used to write her speeches once upon a time.
Oh, really?
Some of them, not all of them, many of them.
Well, that's a great family pedigree. I was telling somebody that if I had that family pedigree, I would find an excuse to drop in a story every single video I did. My uncle, my aunt, my grandparent, you name it. If I had, I had a great grandfather who was Colonel Prescott, who said, "Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes." But unfortunately, after he said that, they all died. So I only can use that story a little bit. But yeah, that's fantastic. That's amazing history.
Thank you very much. Well, Robert, if the Greek in me would have no hesitation in bringing it up all the time, but English diffidence, which I've acquired, has unfortunately made that impossible. But no, she is, and when we meet and we have a good time together, as we certainly will one day, I will tell you all about her. And she was very interested. And by the way, can I just say, she loved the United States. She married an American. She used to come to the United States often. She loved the United States. The country I know that she had always problems with was Britain. She didn't understand it, and she had all kinds of issues with it and the way the British worked. And of course, she always used to campaign vigorously to get the Elgin Marbles returned to London. And I wrote some of those comments and speeches as well.
Yeah, ultimately, they did return to Athens, right?
No, they're still here in London.
No?
They're all in the
They're still in London.
The British clinged on to them like, the precious possessions that no doubt they see them as. But anyway, we got lots of looted artworks from all over the place, by the way. Greece, China, India. Our British museums are full of that sort of thing. But anyway, no, they haven't returned them, not yet.
Well, I figured that out about the good diverse food in London.
Yeah.
I realized, it's wherever the British Empire has been. So, it's like, you can get some good Ethiopian food, some good Indian food, some good, I was like, it's a good Iraqi food even. And it's like, it's wherever the British Empire has been. So I guess it has its benefits, and they're just kind of returning to their roots and just stealing people's stuff randomly now.
Absolutely. Yeah. There we go. The British Empire still casts a very long shadow here. And sometimes in good ways, sometimes not so good.
Precisely.
All right. Fantastic. Robert, thank you. That was fantastic.
That was a lot of fun.
Show. That was a fantastic show. I have been putting in the chat the link to your locals page because at the beginning of the show, I forgot to ask you for that plug, but I've been putting it into the chat the whole way through. Give us the plug for your locals community, Robert.
Oh, sure. The second only to the Duran.locals.com, vivabarneslaw.locals.com, where you can get not only exclusive content, share your own exclusive information and content. I get tons of help from the community on the board that share links and stories and information and insights. And then there's also, most of the content is for free to all the members. There's a hush hush series and a little bit of stuff that's exclusive. And that's where if you want my prediction about the war over a couple of months ago or whenever this was, it started about 50 days ago, you can find it at the hush hush series at vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
And I recommend that hush hush series. That is fantastic. For that alone, it is worth joining that locals community. Definitely check it out, everybody. The one and only Robert Barnes. Thank you very, very much. Robert, Alexander, thank you very, very much. Any final thoughts, gentlemen, before we sign off on this, what is it, Tuesday? On this Tuesday. Any final thoughts?
On this Tuesday. Well, we're living through very interesting times. And I come back to this, a lot going on in Ukraine, a lot going on in Russia. The place where things are still decided ultimately is in the United States. I really believe that in so many things. And let's wait and see what happens at the midterms. And if the Republican Party grassroots are starting to become more forceful and the party is beginning to move towards a more anti-war line on this war, at least, then that's absolutely wonderful. By the way, just to also say, Robert mentioned Jacob Dreisen. We mentioned him in our programs. He's now got a blog, very good blog if you want to follow the war. And by the way, he also, I know he's somehow involved in Republican politics, not quite sure in what way, but he was making very much the same points to me that Robert was making. This is separately, that, the American people are not in support of war at all. And he was very concerned at one time that the Republicans, by taking a very pro-war stance, were risking their prospects in the midterms. So it looks as if that might be shifting, and I certainly hope so.
Yeah, and thanks. The white pill moment this week was Donald John Trump stepping up to the plate and saying and demanding that the West call for a peaceful end to this war. And that was a very and probably the most promising political pronouncement out of the West since this whole thing started. So credit to Trump for finally, could have been there a little earlier, but hey, that's Trump. I hope that's the direction more and more people take here in the States and in the West. And I hope Le Pen at least scares the bejesus out of the European establishment and folks in Brussels on next Monday.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to everybody that has been sending super chats, we will do a dedicated show to answer all the questions via Rumble, Odyssey, YouTube super chats, as well as locals. So we'll answer all those questions. And thank you to our moderators. Once again, thank you to Robert Barnes, the locals page for Robert Barnes. I've been putting it into the chat all night. Definitely join it. It is absolutely fantastic. Alexander, Robert, let's enjoy the rest of the day.
Absolutely.
Take care, everybody.